The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Lawyers shuffled papers, witnesses whispered, and the hum of the air conditioning did little to mask the tension that filled the air. Jack Lawson stood at the back of the room, his palms clammy as he waited for the moment he would step up to the front. At just 17, he wasn't like the others in this room. He wasn't a seasoned lawyer or even someone with years of legal education. He was just a teenager, trying to fight for his best friend's freedom. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched the judge enter the courtroom. Judge Montgomery, a man whose reputation for being tough, even merciless, was well known across the district, walked with the weight of years of experience. His presence alone made everyone in the room straighten their backs, but Jack stood rooted to the spot, trying to steady his nerves. "Order in the court," the bailiff called, his voice echoing through the room. The sound was sharp, commanding, and the room quickly fell silent. Jack swallowed hard, standing a little straighter as he prepared for the moment that would change everything. Judge Montgomery took his seat, glancing around at everyone before his cold gaze fell upon Jack. "So, we have how should I put it?" Judge Montgomery's voice trailed off with an air of mockery, his eyes narrowing as they scanned Jack from head to toe. "A teenager representing himself in court. This should be interesting." Jack's face flushed. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him, the judgment, the smirks, the disbelief. They all thought he was out of his league, that he didn't belong here, that he was just a kid playing pretend. He knew they thought he'd crumble under the pressure. But Jack had something they didn't understand. He had spent years learning everything he could about the law. And today, he was going to prove it. "Your Honor," Jack said, his voice steady but carrying a hint of nerves, "I'm representing my best friend, Daniel Thomas. He's accused of theft, but I believe there's enough evidence to show that he's innocent. I'm ready to present my case." Judge Montgomery raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Innocent? Young man, are you sure you know what you're talking about? This is a court of law, not a playground." Jack clenched his fists, trying to control his growing frustration. He had prepared for this moment, studied the laws, researched past cases, and even practiced his arguments in front of a mirror. But nothing had prepared him for the mocking tone in Montgomery's voice. The judge wasn't just questioning his abilities, he was belittling him. The prosecutor, a man in his late 40s named Mr. Hargrove, leaned back in his chair with a smug grin. "Let's see how this plays out," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Jack to hear. It was clear that no one expected him to succeed. Jack took a deep breath and began his opening statement. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke, "the prosecution has presented a case based on circumstantial evidence. The only proof they have is a fingerprint found on a piece of stolen property, but that fingerprint could have been placed there under any number of circumstances. My client, Daniel Thomas, was in the wrong place at the wrong time, but he did not commit the crime." He paused for a moment, watching as Judge Montgomery's skeptical gaze remained fixed on him. "I will present evidence that proves my client's innocence, and I ask for the jury's patience while I do so." Judge Montgomery leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "Proceed," he said, his tone still laced with mockery. "But don't expect me to go easy on you just because you're a child playing lawyer." Jack ignored the jab. He couldn't afford to be rattled now. This was his moment. This was his chance to prove to everyone, including himself, that he had what it took to succeed. He walked confidently toward the table, where he had arranged his notes, legal textbooks, and case files. He flipped open a folder, revealing the first piece of evidence, a security footage recording. "Your Honor," Jack began, "this is the security footage from the store where the theft occurred. As you can see, the video clearly shows a person walking out of the store with a bag in hand, but the face of the individual is not clearly visible. However, we can see that the person is wearing shoes that are a very specific brand, shoes that belong to my client's cousin, not my client himself." He handed the footage over to the court clerk, who loaded it onto the screen for everyone to see. The room fell silent as the footage played. It was grainy, but it clearly showed the shoes Jack had described. The room was still for a moment before the judge spoke. "This is your big evidence." Judge Montgomery's voice dripped with skepticism. "Some shoes. This is your defense." Jack's stomach churned. He could feel the weight of the doubt in the room, but he pushed forward, undeterred. He continued, presenting witness testimonies, calling in character references, and using his legal knowledge to break down the prosecution's argument. He had a plan, and he wasn't going to let anyone's ridicule distract him. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jack wrapped up his argument. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. There is no concrete proof that Daniel committed the crime. I ask the jury to consider the facts and deliver a fair verdict." He looked up at the jury, whose faces were a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Jack wasn't sure if they were buying it yet, but he had done his best. He had stood his ground and fought with everything he had. Judge Montgomery stood, his expression unreadable. "We will now take a brief recess before deliberations begin. This will be an interesting case to watch, that's for sure." As Jack made his way back to his seat, he could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him. Some were still mocking, others were unsure, but there was one thing he knew for sure: the game had just changed. Jack Lawson, the teenager everyone had written off, had just shown them all that he was more than capable of standing in a courtroom and fighting for what was right. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jack Lawson's story didn't start in a courtroom. It didn't begin with polished legal arguments or high-profile cases. It started with a book and a dream, one that came to him in the quietest of moments, on long summer afternoons when he sat alone in his room reading the dusty old law books he found at garage sales and second-hand stores. Jack wasn't like the other kids in his small town. While most of his peers spent their weekends hanging out at the park or playing video games, Jack was drawn to the law, fascinated by how the world was governed, how justice was served, and how every decision, every ruling, had a ripple effect on people's lives. It wasn't that he came from a family of lawyers or legal professionals. His mother, Linda Lawson, worked long hours as a waitress to make ends meet, and his father had disappeared when Jack was just a baby, leaving a void in his life that neither money nor time could fill. Growing up with a single mom wasn't easy. Linda struggled to make sure there was always food on the table, but she had little time to guide Jack through his schoolwork, let alone the complexities of life. Jack didn't mind. In fact, he admired his mother for her hard work. She was a fighter, a woman who did everything she could to keep their lives afloat. But the absence of a father figure left Jack feeling a little lost, a little confused. He had to figure out things on his own. And that's where the books came in. Jack had always been a good student, but his interest in history and government really took off in high school. His first real brush with law came during a history class in his sophomore year, when they studied famous trials like those of the Scottsboro Boys, the Nuremberg trials, and even modern cases that changed the course of society. It wasn't just the stories that fascinated him, it was the arguments, the way lawyers presented their case, the way they swayed people's opinions, and ultimately, the way the law could right a wrong. That was what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a voice for those who didn't have one. But no one could see that in Jack. At school, he was just another kid in the background, someone who didn't quite fit into any of the social circles. He wasn't a star athlete or a popular kid. He was quiet, observant, and always had his nose buried in a book. His classmates thought of him as weird, even a little odd. But it didn't bother Jack. He had bigger plans, ones that didn't rely on popularity or fitting in. Jack's mother had always told him that education was the key to success. When she could, she'd bring home old textbooks from the diners lost and found, hoping to spark Jack's interest in different subjects. One night, after closing time, Linda handed him a thick, worn-out volume titled The Principles of Law. Jack flipped through the pages, his fingers grazing over the text, the legal jargon like a code he had to crack. It didn't take long for him to get hooked. "Mom, I think I found what I want to do with my life," Jack had said one evening, his voice filled with a quiet excitement. Linda didn't look up from washing dishes, but she smiled softly. "You've always been a smart kid, Jack. If this is what makes you happy, I'll support you." She didn't have much to offer, but she always found a way to back him up, even if it was just with a few encouraging words. Over the next few years, Jack devoured every book he could find on law. He spent hours in the local library, reading case studies, legal textbooks, and even old court transcripts. He wasn't in law school, and he couldn't afford private tutoring, but that didn't stop him. He taught himself everything from civil rights law to criminal procedure, from constitutional debates to obscure legal precedents. But what really made Jack stand out was his ability to break down complex legal concepts and apply them to real-world situations. He started analyzing news stories about trials, following the court proceedings of high-profile cases, and studying how lawyers argued their points. Jack even began to write about his own thoughts on legal matters, creating a blog where he shared his opinions on recent cases and legal theory. While most teenagers were focused on sports or social media, Jack was debating legal philosophy with strangers on the internet, building his knowledge and confidence. The more Jack learned, the more he realized just how powerful the law could be. It wasn't just about winning cases or proving someone right or wrong, it was about making a difference, fighting for justice, and giving a voice to those who had been overlooked or wronged. Jack didn't want to become a lawyer for the fame or the fortune, he wanted to become one because he believed in the system, and he believed that he could make it work for the people who needed it most. But Jack knew that this wasn't going to be easy. There were plenty of roadblocks. For one, he was still just a teenager. People would question his credibility, laugh at his ambitions, and assume that his lack of formal education meant he didn't know what he was talking about. His classmates mocked him when they found out he wanted to be a lawyer. They called him a bookworm and a wannabe lawyer, assuming he was wasting his time. But that didn't stop him. Jack knew that if he worked hard enough, he could prove them wrong. It wasn't until the summer before his senior year in high school that Jack got his first taste of real legal work. One of his classmates, Daniel Thomas, found himself in trouble with the law after being accused of a crime he didn't commit. Daniel had always been a bit of a troublemaker, but Jack knew he wasn't capable of the crime he was being accused of. It was a theft charge, and Daniel had no alibi. Jack knew he could help. He spent weeks preparing Daniel's defense, pulling together research, reading through legal texts, and even meeting with local lawyers to get advice. He wasn't officially part of the case, but he was determined to help his friend. The more he learned, the more he realized that his passion for law could be the thing that helped Daniel, and maybe even the thing that could change his life forever. When Jack volunteered to represent Daniel in court, no one took him seriously. They all assumed it was some sort of joke. A teenager, barely old enough to drive, trying to fight a legal battle that could send his friend to prison. But Jack wasn't deterred. He believed in Daniel's innocence, and he believed in his own ability to make a case. He didn't know it yet, but this case would be the moment that would set him on a path he couldn't turn back from. The road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and doubts. But Jack was ready. He had spent years preparing for this moment. And as he stood in front of the courtroom for the first time, ready to fight for Daniel's future, Jack Lawson knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. The courtroom was almost a second home to Jack Lawson now. The smell of old wood and stale paper, the buzz of hushed voices, the weight of silence before the judge walked in, all of it felt strangely familiar, comforting even. But the challenge ahead was anything but comforting. Jack was about to face the most important test of his life. Jack glanced over at Daniel, sitting nervously beside him. His best friend's face was pale, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. Daniel had never been in trouble like this before. Jack knew that. The accusations were ludicrous. Daniel had been at the wrong place at the wrong time, a scapegoat for a crime he didn't commit. But the world didn't always care about innocence. Sometimes, it was easier to pin the blame on someone who didn't have the means or power to fight back. "We're going to get through this," Jack whispered to Daniel, his voice steady even though his heart raced. Daniel gave him a small, nervous smile but didn't say anything. The doubt was in his eyes, and Jack could feel it. It wasn't just the case weighing on Daniel's mind, it was the fact that Jack was the one defending him. A 17-year-old kid who had no formal legal training, no law degree, no connections. Just a guy who loved reading about the law and believed in justice. The courtroom buzzed as the prosecutor, Mr. Hargrove, made his way to the front. Hargrove was tall, sharp-eyed, and dressed in a tailored suit that screamed experience. He was the kind of lawyer who was used to winning, the kind of lawyer who made even the most experienced defense attorneys second-guess their approach. And now he was about to take on a teenager who had no business being here. "Everyone, take your seats," the bailiff called, and the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Jack's stomach did a flip as he stood up, adjusting his tie. He could feel the eyes of the room on him. They were all waiting for him to fail. He could sense it. They were waiting for him to crumble, to lose his nerve and stumble over his words. But Jack wasn't going to let that happen. He had prepared for this day, and he wasn't about to let anyone's doubt stop him now. Judge Montgomery, the stern-faced man who had been nothing short of dismissive during Jack's opening statement, tapped his gavel to call the session to order. "Let's get this over with," the judge muttered, his eyes not quite meeting Jack's as he glanced at the clock. "Mr. Lawson, you may proceed with your defense." Jack took a deep breath and walked to the front of the courtroom, positioning himself at the defendant's table. He set down his legal notes carefully, his hands slightly trembling but his mind sharp. The first step was always the hardest, the first word, the first sentence. After that, he could find his rhythm. "Your Honor," Jack began, his voice steady as he turned to face the judge and the jury, "I stand before you today not as a lawyer, but as a person who believes in justice, in fairness. The case the prosecution has laid out is based on a misunderstanding. My client, Daniel Thomas, did not commit this crime. I will prove to you that he is innocent." A wave of murmurs ran through the courtroom, the jury exchanging uncertain glances. Jack could feel their skepticism, but he ignored it. He had a job to do. "Let's start with the evidence," Jack continued. "The prosecution claims that my client's fingerprint was found on the stolen property, but the truth is much more complicated than that. The fingerprint alone is not enough to convict anyone, especially not my client, who has no prior criminal history and no reason to commit this crime." He paused and scanned the jury, watching their faces carefully, trying to gauge their reactions. Some seemed curious, others still skeptical, but Jack pressed on. "I'll show you that Daniel was nowhere near the scene of the crime at the time it happened," Jack said confidently. "I will call witnesses, present evidence, and prove that Daniel was elsewhere when the theft occurred." He motioned to the witness list and called the first name. "First, I'd like to call Mr. Alan Walker to the stand. Mr. Walker was with Daniel at the time of the alleged theft and can attest to his whereabouts." The bailiff nodded and directed the court clerk to bring in the witness. Moments later, a man in his 30s with a short, scruffy beard and an unremarkable appearance walked to the stand. He was wearing a plain button-up shirt and jeans, looking less like a witness and more like a bystander. But Jack knew he had to count on him. "Mr. Walker, please state your name and your relationship to the defendant," Jack began, his voice even. "My name is Alan Walker. I've known Daniel for about 5 years. We used to hang out after school and on weekends," Mr. Walker replied, his voice low but clear. Jack nodded, pulling up a chair beside the witness stand. "Can you tell the court where you were on the night of the alleged crime?" Walker shifted in his seat. "We were at my apartment, watching the game. I didn't even know about the robbery until the next day." "Can you prove that?" Jack asked, his voice casual but focused. He couldn't afford any mistakes here. Walker nodded. Yeah, I can. I've got the receipts from the pizza we ordered that night, and the delivery guy can vouch for it. We weren't anywhere near the store where the crime happened. Jack glanced over at the jury, noting the slight shift in their demeanor. This was the first crack in the prosecution's case. This was the first piece of real evidence that could show Daniel was innocent. He turned back to Walker. Thank you, Mr. Walker. I'll submit these receipts into evidence for the court's consideration. As the witness stepped down and the receipts were handed over to the clerk, Jack's heart rate steadied. The first witness was done, and it had gone better than he expected. The prosecution looked displeased, but Jack couldn't let their reactions distract him. He was on a mission. The stakes were high, but Jack had the facts on his side. And he wasn't about to back down now. He moved to the next part of his argument, carefully crafting each point, each question, each response. The prosecution tried to poke holes in his defense, but Jack was prepared. He wasn't just relying on his knowledge of the law, he was relying on the truth, and that was something no one could take away from him. By the end of the day, Jack felt the weight of exhaustion settle in his bones. But there was still hope. The case wasn't over yet. He had one more trick up his sleeve, something that could change everything. As Jack sat down at the defendant's table, he turned to Daniel, offering him a small, encouraging smile. "We're not done yet," Jack whispered. "But we're getting closer." The following morning brought a different kind of energy to the courtroom. The first day had been about establishing Jack Lawson as a serious contender, proving that he wasn't just a kid pretending to know the law. Today, however, the real challenge would come. The prosecution wasn't going to let him get away with easy wins, and they weren't going to let Daniel off the hook so easily. Jack arrived early, as he always did. His mind was racing, each thought spinning faster than the next. He could feel the pressure of the courtroom on his shoulders. This was his chance to prove that a teenager with no formal education could stand toe-to-toe with some of the best legal minds in the city. As he walked into the courtroom, Jack noticed the small crowd in the gallery. It was packed with onlookers, some curious about the kid representing himself, others there to see if Jack's defense would truly hold up. The whispers and murmurs only made him more focused. It was a little intimidating at first, but Jack had learned to tune them out. The only voices that mattered were the ones in his head, the ones guiding him to victory. "Good morning, Mr. Lawson," the judge greeted him as he took his place at the defendant's table. Judge Montgomery's voice was as cold and distant as ever, but Jack didn't let it faze him. "Good morning, Your Honor," Jack replied, standing up to face the court with confidence. The prosecution, Mr. Hargrove, was already seated, his sharp eyes narrowing as he watched Jack with a mix of disbelief and irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged by someone so young, and certainly not someone who was clearly unqualified in the eyes of the law. The smugness in Hargrove's expression made Jack even more determined. The case was moving quickly, with the prosecution focusing on the technicalities of the evidence. But Jack wasn't about to let them derail his momentum. He had a plan, and he intended to stick to it. The first day had been about getting the jury on his side. Today, he was going to take the fight to the prosecution. The prosecutor stood up and addressed the court with his usual poise. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defendant's fingerprints were found on the stolen goods. There is no denying that. And the witness he has presented, Mr. Walker, does not provide an alibi that is both credible and verifiable." Hargrove paused, letting his words hang in the air for dramatic effect. Jack remained calm, his hands resting on the table in front of him. He knew that the prosecution was going to go hard on the fingerprint evidence, trying to make it the centerpiece of their case. But Jack had already anticipated that. He'd done his research. The fingerprint evidence was not as solid as Hargrove made it out to be. It was circumstantial at best, and Jack knew exactly how to punch holes in their argument. "Your Honor, if I may," Jack interrupted, standing up. The judge nodded slightly, signaling for him to proceed. "I would like to call Dr. Natalie Stevens to the stand," Jack said, his voice steady and authoritative. Dr. Stevens was a forensic expert Jack had contacted after his research. She specialized in fingerprint analysis and had helped Jack understand the nuances of the fingerprint evidence in the case. Jack had learned that fingerprints could often be misinterpreted, especially if the conditions surrounding their collection weren't controlled properly. He needed to prove that the prosecution's key piece of evidence wasn't as reliable as they claimed. Dr. Stevens entered the courtroom, dressed in a professional suit. She was a woman in her early 40s with sharp features and a confident demeanor. As she took the stand, Jack felt a wave of reassurance. She was the kind of expert who commanded respect, and Jack knew she was going to help him turn the case around. "Dr. Stevens," Jack began, his voice filled with quiet respect, "can you explain to the court how fingerprint evidence is processed and what factors can affect its reliability?" Dr. Stevens adjusted her glasses and looked directly at the jury. "Fingerprint analysis is not as simple as it may seem. The process involves lifting prints from surfaces, comparing them to known samples, and then determining whether there's a match. However, it's important to understand that the quality of the print, the surface it was found on, and the way the print was lifted all play a crucial role in determining its accuracy." Jack nodded, acknowledging her points. He knew this was important. He needed to plant doubt in the minds of the jury, and Dr. Stevens was the one who could do that. "So, in your professional opinion, Dr. Stevens, would you say that a fingerprint found on a stolen item is enough to conclusively prove guilt?" Jack asked, his voice calm but insistent. "No," Dr. Stevens replied, her tone firm. "Fingerprint evidence is circumstantial. While it can suggest a person's presence at a crime scene, it does not conclusively prove that the person committed the crime. In this case, we don't have enough information about how the fingerprint was collected or the circumstances surrounding it. It could have been left there long before the crime occurred." Jack's heart raced with a sense of victory. This was exactly what he needed. Dr. Stevens had just cast doubt on the entire foundation of the prosecution's case. He could feel the shift in the courtroom, the subtle change in how the jury was looking at the evidence. The once confident prosecutor looked visibly uncomfortable, his smug expression faltering. "Thank you, Dr. Stevens," Jack said, his tone polite but purposeful as he wrapped up the testimony. He turned back to the judge. "I have no further questions, Your Honor." As Dr. Stevens left the stand, Jack could feel the momentum shifting in his favor. The jury was more receptive now, their faces less skeptical, more open. It wasn't over yet, he still had a long way to go, but Jack could see a glimmer of hope. The prosecutor, trying to regain some ground, called his next witness, a police officer who had been present at the crime scene. The officer was prepared to testify that the evidence was clear-cut. Jack listened carefully, but he wasn't worried. He had already anticipated the witness testimony. And he had one more ace up his sleeve. As the afternoon wore on, the courtroom buzzed with intensity. Jack's strategy was coming together. The pieces were falling into place. The fingerprint evidence, the witness testimonies, and the forensic analysis were all working together to chip away at the prosecution's case. It wasn't just about winning anymore, it was about making sure the truth came out. Jack Lawson wasn't just fighting for Daniel anymore. He was fighting for justice. As the day drew to a close, Jack sat back in his chair, his eyes meeting Daniel's. The faintest trace of hope appeared in Daniel's eyes, and for the first time since the trial began, Jack allowed himself to believe that they might just win this. The days following the expert testimony were full of tension and anticipation. The defense had made some significant progress, but the prosecution wasn't backing down. Jack could feel the pressure building. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for the winds to push him either into success or into a devastating fall. The courtroom had grown colder, the weight of the trial pressing on everyone's shoulders. Jack could see the strain in Daniel's eyes. His best friend was trying to stay hopeful, but the fear of the unknown was creeping in. Daniel hadn't said it, but Jack knew the anxiety was there, simmering just beneath the surface. This trial wasn't just about proving a point to the jury, it was about saving a life, about ensuring that Daniel would get a future that wasn't clouded by a criminal record for something he didn't do. Jack had never wanted to become a lawyer, but now, sitting in that courtroom day after day, he was beginning to understand what it meant to fight for justice. It was a feeling that seemed to consume him now. He couldn't let Daniel down. Not when they were so close. The trial had entered its final stages, and both sides had presented their cases. The prosecution had used every trick in the book, presenting their evidence with fiery passion, using their witnesses to paint Daniel as a cold, calculating criminal. But Jack's strategy had been carefully crafted to counter each move they made. He had chipped away at their case piece by piece, and the cracks were beginning to show. But there was one more hurdle, a final test. And Jack was running out of time. The court was now in session, and Jack stood up as he prepared to make his closing statement. His heart beat fast, the final push of adrenaline kicking in. It was the moment of truth. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the jury as they filed back into the room, their expressions unreadable. Jack had no idea which way this would go. The jury had been quiet throughout most of the trial, and their body language now seemed even more unreadable. Some were tense, others neutral, but no one looked convinced just yet. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Jack began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of every word he'd been preparing for the past few weeks. "We've spent the last few days in this courtroom discussing evidence, testimony, and facts. But now it's time to take a step back and look at the bigger picture." Jack paused, letting his words sink in. He knew that this was his final chance to sway the jury, to make them see the truth. He couldn't afford to rush this moment. This was it. "We are not here to debate the minutiae of fingerprint analysis or argue about the reliability of eyewitnesses. We are here because a young man, Daniel Thomas, is facing a future that is being decided right here, right now. He is facing a future that has been built on a lie. And that lie has been carefully constructed by the prosecution." Jack's voice became firmer, more impassioned as he spoke. "We've shown that the fingerprint evidence, the key piece of the prosecution's case, is unreliable. We've proven that Daniel had an alibi, that he was nowhere near the crime scene when it occurred. We've heard testimony from credible witnesses, and we've seen the inconsistencies in the prosecution's arguments. Yet, they still insist that Daniel is guilty." Jack walked slowly in front of the jury, making sure to look each one of them in the eye. He had to make them feel the weight of what was at stake, to make them understand the consequences of their decision. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jack said, his tone dropping to a near whisper, "if you convict Daniel Thomas based on the evidence presented here, you are not upholding justice. You are committing an injustice. And you are sentencing an innocent man to a life that he doesn't deserve." There was a long pause as Jack let his words resonate. The room was eerily quiet, the tension thick in the air. The jury's eyes followed him as he returned to his seat. "I have no more to say. The evidence speaks for itself. It's time for you to make the right choice," Jack concluded, his voice calm but resolute. With that, he sat down, his heart pounding in his chest. He had laid it all out there. It was now in the hands of the jury. He couldn't control how they would vote, but he knew he had done everything he could. He had done more than anyone ever expected him to. And in a way, that was enough. If the jury found Daniel guilty, at least Jack knew he'd fought like hell for the truth. The prosecutor, Mr. Hargrove, stood to make his own closing statement. He was, as always, calm, collected, and assured of his victory. The years of experience he had in court were evident in the way he carried himself, but Jack wasn't intimidated. Hargrove's smooth words would be the same as they had been throughout the trial, designed to sway the jury with emotion, not logic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hargrove began, his voice oozing confidence, "you have heard all the evidence. The defendant's fingerprints were found at the scene of the crime. His alibi is weak at best, and we have shown time and time again that Daniel Thomas is guilty of the crime he is accused of. Hargrove went on, reiterating his argument that the evidence was irrefutable and that Daniel's claims of innocence were nothing more than the desperate cries of a teenager caught in a lie. We cannot allow a criminal like this to go free. He will stop at nothing to avoid punishment, but we must ensure that justice is served. The truth is clear. Daniel Thomas is guilty. Hargrove's words were powerful, calculated, and delivered with precision. The jury listened intently, clearly weighing every word he said. Jack could see that they were still on the fence, still uncertain. The next few minutes would decide everything. The court session ended for the day, and the jury was dismissed for deliberation. Jack felt a strange combination of exhaustion and hope. The battle wasn't over yet, but he knew that he had given it his all. His mind replayed every moment of the trial, every word he had said, every move he had made. As he sat in the defendant's seat, Daniel leaned over and whispered, "Do you think we've done enough?" Jack turned to him, offering a reassuring smile. "We've done everything we could. The rest is in their hands." As the bailiff called for everyone to rise, Jack could only hope that the jury would see the truth, that they would recognize the innocent young man in front of them and not the criminal the prosecution tried to portray. The room was silent as the jury filed back into the courtroom. Jack Lawson sat in his chair, his palms sweating despite the cool air conditioning in the building. He could feel his heart racing. This was it. The moment that would determine the fate of his best friend, Daniel Thomas. He glanced over at Daniel, whose expression mirrored Jack's own anxiety. His best friend was trying to stay calm, but Jack could see the tension in his body, the way his fingers twitched nervously. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the jury members took their seats. They hadn't spoken to anyone during their deliberations. The decision was entirely in their hands, and it felt like a weight on Jack's shoulders. For the past few days, Jack had carefully orchestrated every moment of his defense. He had built the case, fought the prosecution's every move, and presented the evidence in the clearest way possible. But in the end, it all came down to one thing: would the jury believe him? "Will the jury please rise?" The judge's voice echoed in the room, and everyone stood automatically. Jack's knees felt weak, but he straightened up, trying to maintain the air of professionalism he had learned to carry in the courtroom. The foreperson of the jury, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose, stood up and addressed the judge. "We, the jury, have reached a verdict." Jack's breath caught in his throat. He exchanged a quick glance with Daniel, who was now gripping the armrests of his chair tightly, his knuckles white. "Please read the verdict," Judge Montgomery ordered, his voice serious and composed. The foreperson cleared her throat and read aloud, "In the case of the State of California versus Daniel Thomas, we the jury find the defendant, Daniel Thomas, not guilty on all charges." The words hit Jack like a thunderclap. The weight that had been pressing on his chest for the past several days lifted in an instant. It was as if a fog had been cleared from his mind, and he could breathe again. He looked at Daniel, whose face transformed from fear to disbelief, and then to a radiant, joyful smile. Tears welled up in Jack's eyes. He couldn't believe it. He had done it. They had won. The courtroom erupted into whispers, some of them gasps of disbelief, others of relief. The tension that had filled the room since the trial's beginning melted away as the reality of the verdict settled in. Daniel stood up slowly, as if in a daze, and walked over to Jack. The two friends locked eyes for a brief moment before Daniel wrapped his arms around Jack in a tight hug. Jack squeezed back, feeling the rush of emotion flood through him. "You did it, Jack. You actually did it," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. Jack pulled back and smiled at him. "We did it. You're free." For a moment, the world outside the courtroom seemed irrelevant. There was no sound except the quiet murmur of the crowd, no distractions, just the two of them. They had come so far, through doubt, fear, and pressure, but they had made it. Daniel was innocent, and the truth had finally prevailed. The judge, who had been watching the scene quietly, finally spoke, his voice softer than usual. "This court stands adjourned. Mr. Thomas, you are free to go." The sound of the gavel hitting the block broke the moment, and the crowd began to shuffle toward the exits. But Jack and Daniel didn't move right away. They stayed rooted to the spot, savoring the moment as if it could last forever. Jack felt a sense of pride unlike anything he had ever known. It was as though he had earned his place in the world, not just by helping Daniel, but by proving to himself that he was capable of standing up for what was right. The teen who had once been nothing more than an observer of the legal world had just navigated the labyrinth of a criminal trial and emerged victorious. "You're free now, Daniel. You can finally put this behind you," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel nodded, but there was a shadow of something else in his eyes, something Jack hadn't expected. "I don't know what to do with myself now," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel looked down at his feet, struggling to put the words together. "This trial, this whole thing, it's been my life for so long now. I don't know what to do without it hanging over me." Jack placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "We'll figure it out, Daniel. You're free to live your life now. Don't waste any more time thinking about what was. Focus on what's next." Daniel's lips twitched upward into a small, uncertain smile. "Yeah. I guess you're right." As they walked out of the courtroom together, the weight of the world lifted off both of their shoulders. The trial was over. The nightmare that had haunted Daniel's every waking moment was behind him. And Jack, well, Jack had proven that he was more than just a kid. He was a force to be reckoned with. The celebration that followed was small, just the two of them and their closest friends. Daniel insisted on taking Jack out for dinner at a diner they had gone to after school when things were simpler, when they were just two friends hanging out and talking about their futures, before all this had happened. As they sat down at a booth and ordered their food, Jack couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. He had gone from a teenager barely out of high school to someone who had navigated the complexities of a criminal trial and won. He'd learned more about himself in the last few weeks than he had in the past few years. The weight of the world may have been lifted from Daniel's shoulders, but Jack felt as though he had gained a new sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of what it meant to fight for something greater than himself. As they ate, Jack found himself laughing at the things that once seemed so important, but in the grand scheme of things, didn't matter. He was free. Daniel was free. They had won. "I've got to admit, I'm still kind of amazed," Daniel said, looking at Jack across the table. "I mean, you were just a kid when you started this whole thing, and now look at you. You're practically a lawyer." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm no lawyer. But maybe one day." Daniel raised his glass in a small toast. "To the kid who could." Jack smiled and clinked his glass against Daniel's. "To us." For the first time in a long time, Jack felt like the world was full of possibilities. The road ahead was uncertain, but whatever it held, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't afraid to face it. And neither was Daniel. The days following the trial were filled with an overwhelming sense of relief, but the world around Jack and Daniel felt strangely empty. They had spent so much time focused on the trial that now, with the legal battle behind them, the future was a wide-open space, filled with possibilities, but also uncertainty. Daniel had made it clear that he wanted to put the past behind him, but Jack could see the weight still lingering in his friend's eyes. The months of being under constant stress, the fear of what might happen if they lost the case, had left their marks on Daniel. The freedom was liberating, but it was also disorienting. For so long, the trial had been the center of Daniel's world, and now he had to learn how to live again, without that looming over him. Jack, on the other hand, had found a sense of purpose he hadn't expected. The time spent preparing for the trial, the intense research, the courtroom strategies, it had awakened something inside him. He had always liked problem solving, but now he was seriously considering the possibility of a future in law. His interactions with the legal system, the way he had been able to navigate the court, had shown him that he could do more than just get through it, he could excel in it. But for now, it was time to take a step back. The first thing Jack did after the trial ended was talk to his parents. They had been supportive, but Jack had been so absorbed in the case that he hadn't shared much about how it had affected him. Now, he was ready to open up. He sat down at the kitchen table, his mother's comforting presence filling the room. His dad was off to work, but his mom always had a way of making things feel a little less overwhelming. "Jack, honey, how are you feeling?" she asked gently as she set down a plate of homemade cookies in front of him. She always knew how to make him feel at home. Jack smiled weakly. "I'm okay, I guess. It's just a lot to process. The trial, everything that happened. I didn't realize how much it would take out of me." "I know, sweetie. But you did something incredible," she said, placing a hand on his. "You helped your friend. You saved him. You've shown a strength I didn't even know you had." Jack shifted uncomfortably. "It's not just me. Daniel, he's been through so much. He's the one who had to live with all that fear and doubt." His mom nodded. "I know. But you were there for him every step of the way. And that's what matters. Not everyone would do that. Not everyone has the courage to fight for what's right, even when it's hard." Jack sat back, taking a deep breath. He hadn't thought about it that way. His mom was right. He had done something more than just get through a difficult situation. He had fought for what was right, for his best friend's freedom, and for the truth. "Thanks, Mom. I think I've figured out what I want to do next." His mom smiled knowingly. "Oh, I have a feeling I know what that is." Jack looked down at the table, feeling a little unsure. "I think I want to study law. I mean, I don't know exactly what kind of lawyer I'd be, but I know I want to help people. I don't think I could go back to just being a regular high school graduate, working a regular job. I want to do something that matters." His mom's smile widened, her eyes sparkling with pride. "I'm so proud of you, Jack. I think that's a wonderful decision. And I know you'll be amazing at it." Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. He hadn't expected such an immediate, positive reaction from his mom, but it felt like a confirmation of what he had been feeling inside. It was scary, but it was also exciting. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a real direction, something that went beyond the momentary victories of winning a case. He was thinking about the future, not just his own, but the kind of world he wanted to help create. Meanwhile, Daniel was still adjusting to life outside the courtroom. He had spent days away from the public eye, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. His parents had taken him on a small vacation to clear his head, but when he came back, he still seemed restless. Jack hadn't heard from him much, and he wondered what was going through Daniel's mind. Jack decided to check in on him. He texted Daniel, "Hey man, how are you holding up?" Daniel's reply came almost immediately, "I'm okay. Just trying to figure out what comes next. But honestly, it feels like everything is a little too quiet. I keep expecting someone to show up and say that it's all been a mistake and I have to go back to court." Jack understood that feeling. After all, he had spent the past few months completely consumed by the trial. It had been their lives, their focus. But now, the silence was deafening. "Well, I'm here if you need to talk." "I know it's not easy," Jack replied. "Maybe we should hang out sometime soon, get out of our heads for a bit." Daniel agreed, and they set a time to meet up. Jack knew that while the court case was over, the emotional aftermath for Daniel was far from finished. But it was a step in the right direction. They both needed to process everything, and maybe the best way to do that was by reconnecting to the simpler parts of life. A few days later, Jack and Daniel found themselves sitting at the same diner they used to visit after school. It was a place that carried memories of their carefree days before everything got complicated. As they sat down at the same booth, the weight of the world seemed to lift just a little. "I don't think I've been here since, before everything," Daniel said, glancing around at the familiar surroundings. Jack nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, it's been a while. Feels good to be back in a place where we don't have to worry about anything except what to order for dinner." Daniel laughed, the sound light and genuine. It was the first time in a long time that Jack had heard him laugh like that. It was as if a little piece of the old Daniel was returning. "I'm glad we're doing this," Daniel said, his tone quieter now, more reflective. "I don't know how to go back to normal, but maybe this is the start of something new." Jack smiled, looking at his friend. "I think it's a pretty good start." For the first time since the trial began, Jack allowed himself to relax. It was clear that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still plenty of questions, uncertainties, and obstacles to overcome. But with Daniel by his side, Jack knew they could face whatever came next. The week after Jack and Daniel's dinner at the diner felt like the calm before a storm. Jack had thrown himself into researching law schools and had started taking some preparatory courses. He was eager, driven by the excitement of a new direction in life. His family had been supportive, and his friends, especially Daniel, seemed to think it was a good choice. But even as Jack worked toward this new goal, he couldn't help but feel like there was something more he needed to do. The feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. He wasn't just meant to study law, he was meant to challenge it. There had to be more he could do to prepare himself for the complex world of criminal law, the world he had just stepped into, only a few months ago. And that's when it happened. Jack was at the library one evening, looking through textbooks on criminal defense, when he received a phone call. It was from an unfamiliar number. He hesitated but answered. "Hello?" Jack asked. "Is this Jack Lawson?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar but sharp. There was something professional about the tone, but also a bit urgent. "Yeah, this is Jack," he replied cautiously. "Who's this?" "My name is Rebecca Matthews. I'm with the legal firm Stewart and Associates. We've been following your involvement in the Thomas case, and we think you have potential." Jack's heart skipped a beat. This couldn't be real. Stewart and Associates was one of the top law firms in the country. They specialized in criminal defense, handling high-profile cases for some of the wealthiest clients in the country. To think that they were calling him, a teenager with no formal legal education yet, it didn't make sense. "I'm sorry, but I think you might have the wrong person," Jack said, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a kid who helped his friend. That's all." "I'm aware," Rebecca said smoothly, as if she had anticipated Jack's reaction. "That's exactly why we're calling you. You showed an impressive grasp of legal strategy, and more importantly, the ability to think outside the box. We want to offer you an opportunity to work with us as a legal assistant. It's a trial position, and it's meant for someone with your instincts, your drive, and your potential." Jack felt his head spinning. "Wait, you're offering me a job? As a legal assistant?" "That's right," Rebecca said. "We'd like to see what you can do. If you prove yourself, there may be room for more. We want to see if you can handle the pressure of a real legal environment. What do you think?" Jack sat back in his chair, stunned. He wasn't sure what to say. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. But he had no formal legal experience. Could he really take on a role like that? Was he ready? "I don't know," he admitted, trying to gather his thoughts. "I mean, I'd be honored, but I'm not sure I'm qualified. I haven't even started law school yet." "We're not looking for qualifications, Jack. We're looking for someone who can think quickly, who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty and who has an instinct for the law. You showed that during the trial, and we believe you can apply it here. You'd be working closely with our senior attorneys, assisting in case research, drafting documents, and maybe even sitting in on meetings. It's a learning experience, and it could be a great stepping stone for your future. Jack took a deep breath. This was everything he had dreamed of, everything he had wanted ever since he'd helped Daniel. He had always wanted to be involved in something meaningful, to prove to himself that he could make a real difference. But this was bigger than he had imagined. This wasn't just a part-time job, this was an entry into the world he had fantasized about. "I'm in," Jack said without thinking. "Excellent," Rebecca replied, her voice smooth. "We'll send over the details, and we can meet to discuss the next steps. Don't worry, Jack. We'll be here to guide you." As soon as he hung up, Jack could barely breathe. He felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. This was his chance to prove that he wasn't just a kid who got lucky in a courtroom. He could be more. He would be more. The next few days were a blur of excitement and nerves. Jack received an official letter from Stewart and Associates, outlining the details of his new role. He would be starting in a few days, working as a legal assistant at the firm's downtown office. They had given him a small workspace and told him that his first task would be assisting in research for a case involving a prominent businessman accused of embezzling millions of dollars. Jack couldn't believe it, he was going to be part of a real legal case. This was his chance to make a real difference. But even as he prepared for this new chapter, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else he had to figure out. He had put so much effort into helping Daniel that he hadn't fully considered what this new path meant for their friendship. When Jack told Daniel about the opportunity, Daniel's reaction was one of complete surprise. "You're doing what?" Daniel exclaimed, looking at Jack with wide eyes. "You're going to work at Stewart and Associates. That's insane." "I know, it's crazy," Jack said, laughing nervously. "But it's real. They want me to help out, get some experience, maybe even work on a case." Daniel looked at him, awe in his expression. "Man, this is amazing. I'm proud of you. But, are you sure you're ready for something like this?" Jack hesitated. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I'm going to give it my best shot. It's what I want to do." Daniel nodded slowly. "Just promise me you won't forget about everything we've been through. I know things are changing, but you're my friend. Don't let this new world change you." Jack smiled, appreciating the sentiment. "I won't forget, Daniel. I promise." As Jack prepared for his first day at Stewart and Associates, the reality of what he was about to embark on started to settle in. This wasn't just a job. It was a chance to step into a world he had only ever dreamed about. But with this new opportunity came a new set of challenges. The firm's expectations would be high, the work would be demanding, and Jack would have to prove himself every single day. But Jack wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He was ready. The night before Jack's first day at Stewart and Associates, he couldn't sleep. His mind kept racing, about the work, about the expectations, about how he would measure up to the seasoned professionals he was about to work with. This wasn't just any job. This was the opportunity of a lifetime, a stepping stone into the world of law that Jack had only ever dreamed about. And it was real. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of it all pressing down on him. Tomorrow, he would walk into the firm's sleek downtown offices. Tomorrow, he would meet lawyers who had spent decades honing their craft. He was just a teenager, with no formal education in law, no connections, just a passion for justice and a desire to learn. Would they see him as a novelty, a kid playing dress-up? Or would they take him seriously? Jack glanced at his phone. He had a message from Daniel. "Good luck tomorrow, man. You've got this. Just remember, don't get intimidated by anyone. You're the one with the brains, not them." Jack smiled. Daniel always knew how to calm his nerves, even from a distance. Jack typed back quickly. "Thanks, Daniel. I'll do my best. I just hope I don't mess up. You won't. Just stay true to yourself. Jack put his phone down, took a deep breath, and tried to push the anxiety aside. Tomorrow was just the beginning. It was a chance to prove that he belonged in this world. The next morning, Jack stood in front of the full-length mirror in his bedroom, adjusting his suit. He'd spent the past hour picking out the right outfit, trying to look professional, but not too stiff. It had been his first time buying something this formal. His mom had insisted on coming with him to pick out a suit, and Jack had to admit, it felt good to be prepared. But as he looked at his reflection, he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't quite belong. He was just a high school senior in a suit, after all. "Mom, what do you think?" Jack called out as he stood in front of the mirror. She entered the room, giving him a once-over. "You look great, Jack. Really professional. You're going to knock them dead." Jack gave her a weak smile. "I hope so. I really do. Don't worry, sweetheart. Just be yourself. And remember, you're there to learn, not to be perfect. You've got so much potential. Don't be afraid to ask questions and show them what you're capable of." Jack nodded, his nerves a little less raw now that his mom had given him her reassurance. He didn't know what the day would bring, but he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't afford to be afraid of making mistakes. He had to take every opportunity to learn. After a quick breakfast, Jack grabbed his briefcase, an old leather one his mom had found at a second-hand store, and headed out the door. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he pushed the nerves down. This was his chance. No turning back. The office building was towering, sleek, and intimidating. Jack stood outside for a moment, looking up at the glass facade that gleamed in the morning sun. He couldn't help but feel small in comparison. The glass doors slid open automatically, and he stepped inside, the cool air conditioning hitting him like a wave. Inside, the lobby was a testament to wealth and power. Polished marble floors, modern art pieces on the walls, and high-end furniture in the seating areas. Jack felt out of place, like a fish swimming in a tank that was far too big for him. He approached the receptionist, who looked at him with a polite smile. "How can I help you?" she asked, her voice businesslike but warm. "I'm Jack Lawson," he said, his voice slightly unsteady. "I'm here for the legal assistant position." She nodded. "Of course, Mr. Lawson. Please take the elevator to the 17th floor. When you arrive, someone will be there to greet you." Jack gave a nervous nod and stepped toward the elevator. As he waited for the doors to open, he tried to calm his racing heart. This was it. This was the beginning of something big. The elevator doors slid open on the 17th floor, and Jack stepped into a large, modern office space. It was quiet, but not in a cold way. The hum of phones and quiet conversations gave the space a sense of calm professionalism. Jack was met by Rebecca Matthews, the attorney who had called him a few days ago. "Jack, welcome," she said with a warm smile, extending her hand. "I'm so glad you could make it." Jack shook her hand, trying to maintain his composure. "Thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it." Rebecca led him down a long hallway filled with glass-walled offices. "We're thrilled to have you here. I'm sure you'll fit right in." Jack followed her, trying to soak it all in. The offices were a far cry from his high school classroom. The air smelled different, the quiet buzz of focused work was palpable. It felt like a world he had never stepped foot in before, and now, he was a part of it. She stopped at a desk at the far end of the hallway. "This will be your desk for now," she said, gesturing to a small cubicle with a computer and piles of legal paperwork. "You'll be working with the research team today. We have a few cases that need your attention." Jack nodded. "I'm ready." "I'm sure you are. And don't worry, we'll guide you through everything. Today, you'll be helping with some background research for a case we're handling." It's about a businessman who's been accused of embezzling money from a company. We need to find out everything we can about the company and the people involved. Think you can handle it? Jack swallowed his nerves and nodded. Absolutely. Great. Let's get started. Jack spent the next few hours sifting through paperwork and poring over documents. He'd done research before, but nothing like this. The material was dense, full of legal jargon and financial data, but Jack took to it quickly. He felt a strange sense of pride as he uncovered relevant details about the company involved in the case, piecing together information that others might overlook. It felt like he was unlocking secrets, unraveling a puzzle piece by piece. Rebecca checked in on him a few times throughout the day, giving him pointers on how to focus his research. Jack was surprised at how comfortable he felt in the office. The lawyers were busy, but they didn't treat him like a nuisance. They seemed to appreciate his contributions, even though they were small. By the end of the day, Jack was exhausted but exhilarated. He had learned so much already, and he could see that his instincts were leading him in the right direction. As he gathered his things to leave, Rebecca walked over to him. "You did great today, Jack. Keep this up, and you'll be on the fast track. We'll have more work for you soon. I think you'll be a great addition to the team." Jack smiled, a sense of accomplishment swelling in his chest. "Thank you. I won't let you down." As he left the office, the sun had already set, and the city was bathed in the soft glow of evening lights. Jack felt like a new person. He had faced his first day in this new world, and he had survived. More than that, he had thrived. The path ahead was still uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure: he was ready for whatever came next. Jack woke up to the sound of his alarm blaring, the bright morning light spilling through his window. He rubbed his eyes, still feeling the remnants of yesterday's excitement buzzing in his veins. His first day at Stewart and Associates had been everything he'd hoped for, and more. The tasks had been challenging but not impossible, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. But he couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. Today, he would be expected to prove himself in ways he hadn't anticipated. He quickly got dressed, skipping breakfast in his usual rush to get out the door. As he drove to the office, his mind raced with all the things he had to do. There was still so much he didn't know, so much he had to learn. But something inside him kept pushing him forward, a quiet voice telling him that this was his shot, his big chance. He couldn't afford to mess up. When Jack arrived at Stewart and Associates, he was greeted with a busier atmosphere than the day before. The lawyers seemed more rushed, more focused. The buzz in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Rebecca Matthews, his supervisor, was the first to approach him as he entered the office. "Morning, Jack," she said briskly, a stack of papers in her hand. "I need you to sit down with one of the senior partners today. You'll be helping him prepare for a meeting with a high-profile client. It's a big deal, so make sure you're sharp. We need everything ready by noon. Think you can handle it?" Jack's heart skipped a beat. A senior partner? A high-profile client? He hadn't expected this level of responsibility so soon. "Of course," Jack said, trying to sound confident. "I'm ready." Rebecca nodded, but there was an edge to her voice. "This isn't just any meeting, Jack. The firm's reputation is on the line here. So, don't let me down." Jack swallowed his nerves and nodded. "I won't." She gave him a quick smile, but it was more professional than warm. "Good. Meet me in the conference room in 15 minutes. We'll go over everything." Jack hurried to his desk, gathering the necessary materials for the meeting. He had learned quickly that preparation was key in the legal world. The more prepared he was, the less likely he was to get caught off guard. As he sat down, pulling up the case files on his computer, he couldn't help but feel a wave of pressure. This was it, the first real test of his abilities. 15 minutes later, Jack met Rebecca in the conference room. The room was large, with a long, polished wooden table at the center. A few of the senior partners were already seated around the table, their expressions serious as they discussed details of the case. Jack took a seat near the back, trying not to draw too much attention to himself. Rebecca stood up and introduced him. "This is Jack Lawson. He's one of our new legal assistants, and he's been helping with case research. He'll be sitting in on the meeting today." One of the senior partners, a man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair, nodded at Jack. "Good to meet you, Jack," he said, but there was no real warmth in his tone. "You're here to learn, I assume?" Jack nodded. "Yes, sir. I'm here to help however I can." Rebecca quickly got down to business. "As you all know, we have a meeting with Mr. Harrison later this afternoon. He's a key client, and we need to be ready with the latest updates on his case. Jack, you're going to assist Mr. Harris with some of the preliminary paperwork. We need everything organized and ready for the meeting. The stakes are high on this one." Jack felt his pulse quicken. Mr. Harrison. The name echoed in his mind. He knew that name. Harrison was one of the wealthiest men in the state. His company had been accused of multiple fraudulent activities, and the case had been making headlines for months. If Jack could make a good impression on this case, it could open doors for him that he couldn't even begin to imagine. Rebecca turned to the senior partner, Mr. Harris, a tall man with glasses and a sharp jawline. "Jack's here to assist you. I want him to get up to speed on the case right away. Let's not waste time." Mr. Harris looked Jack over for a moment before nodding curtly. "All right, Lawson. Let's see what you're made of." For the next few hours, Jack worked alongside Mr. Harris, reading through piles of legal documents, reviewing financial statements, and preparing a list of key points for the upcoming meeting. The pressure was overwhelming. Each time Jack found a discrepancy or a new piece of information that could potentially change the direction of the case, he had to ask himself, was this important? Was this something they needed to bring up in the meeting? He didn't have the experience to know for sure, but his gut instinct was telling him to trust his judgment. As the clock ticked closer to noon, Jack could feel his nerves tightening. He had already made a few mistakes, small things, like misplacing a document or not citing a source properly in one of his memos, but he had corrected them quickly. Still, the fear of messing up loomed over him. These were the kinds of mistakes that could cost someone their job, and Jack wasn't ready to lose this opportunity. Finally, as noon arrived, the meeting with Mr. Harrison began. Jack stayed in the background, observing as Mr. Harris and the other partners spoke with the client. Harrison was a large man, with a booming voice and a presence that filled the room. His lawyer's words were calm and measured, but Jack could sense the tension in the room. This wasn't just a legal case, it was a battle for control, a fight over millions of dollars. Jack tried to focus on the discussion, his mind racing as he analyzed every word and every movement. This was what it was all about, the high-stakes world of criminal defense. And he was right in the middle of it. At one point, Mr. Harris turned to Jack. "What's your take on the financial report, Lawson?" he asked, his tone serious. Jack's heart skipped a beat. His mind immediately raced back to the document he had been working on earlier. There had been an irregularity, a small one, but still noticeable. He hadn't had time to research it thoroughly, but he had a hunch. "Well," Jack began, his voice shaky but determined, "there's a discrepancy in the way some of the transactions were reported. It looks like certain payments might have been disguised as operational expenses when, in reality, they could be considered illegal transfers." The room went silent for a moment. Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting there's a pattern of fraud in these reports?" "I believe so," Jack said, feeling his confidence building. "If you look at the dates and the amounts, there's a significant amount of money being transferred during critical periods, and it doesn't match up with the company's reported income." The partners exchanged glances. For a moment, Jack felt like he might be overstepping his bounds, but then Mr. Harris nodded. "That's a good observation, Lawson. We'll look into it." "Thank you." After the meeting, Jack felt like he had just run a marathon. His hands were shaking from the adrenaline, but he couldn't stop the feeling of satisfaction. He had contributed something meaningful, something that could actually change the direction of the case. Rebecca walked over to him as the partners began to clear out. "Nice work, Jack," she said, her voice tinged with approval. "That was a sharp catch. You've got an eye for detail." Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "Thanks, Rebecca. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything important." "You didn't. You're on the right track. Keep it up." As Jack walked out of the office later that evening, he couldn't help but feel like the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. He had survived his first real test at Stewart and Associates, and he had come out on top. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The real challenges were only just starting. And Jack was ready for them. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jack awoke the next morning with the faint memory of a restless night. His mind had been racing over the events of the day before, his first major contribution to a case, the looks of approval from the senior partners, and most of all, his growing realization that he was no longer just a kid with big dreams. He was a part of something real, something important. But the victory was short-lived. By mid-morning, Jack could feel the weight of the expectations pressing down on him. The praise he had received for spotting the financial discrepancy had been gratifying, but he knew it wasn't enough. It was only a small part of the bigger picture, and he would need to keep proving himself every single day. The pressure was starting to build. The office buzzed with activity when Jack arrived at Stewart and Associates that morning. The atmosphere felt different today. There was a sense of urgency in the air, with lawyers moving quickly from one task to another. Jack sat down at his desk, trying to shake off his nerves. He was already working on several cases simultaneously, each requiring his attention, but the thought of what was next for him loomed large in his mind. Rebecca Matthews approached his desk with a folder in hand. Her expression was focused, almost unreadable. She handed him the folder without saying a word. "Go over these documents," she said, her tone clipped. "This is for an upcoming hearing. The client is expecting us to have a solid defense, and we need everything ready by tomorrow. I need your full attention on this." Jack nodded, swallowing hard. "Got it. I'll start right away." As Rebecca walked away, Jack opened the folder and scanned the contents. The case was another corporate fraud case, this time involving a high-profile tech startup accused of misleading investors. It wasn't quite as high stakes as the Harrison case, but it was still a big deal, one that could put the firm in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons if they didn't get it right. His mind raced as he read through the documents. There were emails, financial reports, and testimonies from former employees. He could already tell that this case would be complex, requiring a deep dive into corporate structures and legal loopholes. But what struck him the most was the timeline. The company had been under investigation for months, and yet there was still so much to uncover. Jack felt a growing sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about impressing his bosses anymore. This was about doing his part to ensure the firm's success, to prove that he deserved to be in this world. He could feel the weight of that responsibility building on his shoulders. As Jack dove deeper into the case, the hours slipped by unnoticed. He pored over the documents, analyzing the details, looking for anything that could give the firm an edge. It was grueling work, but Jack was determined to prove himself. He stayed late at the office, long after the other lawyers had gone home, until the only sounds in the building were the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rustle of paper as Jack flipped through yet another file. Just as Jack was about to call it a night, his phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "How's the new job going? Still killing it?" Jack smiled and quickly typed back. It's intense. I've been working non-stop on a corporate fraud case. No sleep, but I'm learning so much. Sounds like you're living the dream. Keep at it. I know you'll get there. Jack stared at the message for a moment before putting his phone down. Daniel's words were a reminder of why he was doing all of this, to prove that he could make it, to show that his hard work would pay off. But even as he thought about Daniel's encouragement, he felt a pang of doubt. Was he really cut out for this? Did he have what it took to succeed in this cutthroat world? The next day, Jack arrived at the office early, eager to finish reviewing the documents before the morning meeting. He knew time was running out, and he couldn't afford to miss anything important. As he sat at his desk, reading through another batch of financial statements, Rebecca came over. I need you to meet with Mr. Harris in his office, she said. He's expecting you. You'll be helping him prepare for a client meeting later today. Jack's stomach tightened. Mr. Harris. The senior partner who had barely acknowledged him on his first day. He had been polite, but distant. Jack had heard rumors about him, about his high expectations, his tough demeanor, and his zero tolerance for mistakes. This was a man who wouldn't give anyone a second chance if they failed. But Jack couldn't afford to let fear hold him back. He stood up and nodded. Okay. I'll go right now. When Jack entered Mr. Harris's office, the man was sitting at his desk, surrounded by stacks of legal files. His glasses were perched on the bridge of his nose as he focused intently on a document in front of him. He didn't even look up when Jack entered. Sit, Mr. Harris said, his voice commanding. Jack sat down across from him, trying to hide the anxiety in his chest. I need you to go over these case notes, Mr. Harris continued, sliding a thick stack of papers toward Jack. I want your analysis on the defense strategy for this client. Look through the evidence, make sure everything is in order, and give me your thoughts. I'll be reviewing them in an hour. Jack nodded, taking the papers. Understood. As Jack flipped through the pages, he felt his mind spinning. The case was complicated, there were multiple witnesses, conflicting evidence, and no clear strategy for how to defend the client. The pressure mounted as Jack realized that he was being asked to think like a seasoned lawyer, to take on a role far bigger than his title as a legal assistant. It felt like too much. There were moments when Jack felt like he was drowning in the complexity of the case. His hands shook slightly as he scribbled down his thoughts, trying to make sense of the chaos. He couldn't stop thinking about his first day at the firm, the looks of approval, the praise for his sharp eye, but now, it felt different. He was no longer just a bright kid trying to impress. He was expected to contribute at the level of a professional, to have answers, to make decisions that could change the course of a case. An hour later, Jack walked back to Mr. Harris's office, his mind buzzing with thoughts and ideas. He couldn't believe he was actually about to present his analysis to a senior partner. His heart was racing, and his palms were sweaty, but he knew there was no turning back now. Mr. Harris looked up as Jack entered the office. Let's hear it, he said. Jack took a deep breath and began. Based on the evidence, I believe we have a strong case for self-defense. The witness testimonies point to the client acting in a moment of panic, not with premeditated intent. However, the lack of clear physical evidence could hurt our argument, so we'll need to focus on discrediting the opposing side's claims. Mr. Harris listened intently, not interrupting as Jack explained his reasoning. Jack felt a small sense of relief as he continued, gaining confidence with each word. When he finished, Mr. Harris leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk. You've got potential, Lawson, he said finally. You've got a good head on your shoulders. But don't get cocky. You've got a long way to go before you're ready to handle a case like this on your own. Jack nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Thank you, sir. I'll keep working hard. As Jack left Mr. Harris's office, he couldn't help but feel both proud and overwhelmed. He had just given his first real legal analysis to a senior partner. But the pressure was only going to get harder from here. Jack knew that his journey was far from over, and that the real challenges were still ahead. But one thing was certain, Jack was no longer just a kid with dreams. He was starting to become the kind of lawyer he had always wanted to be. The following days blurred together in a haze of long hours and endless cases. Jack's mind was constantly occupied with legal terms, court schedules, and intricate documents. He had quickly learned that in the legal world, there was no such thing as downtime. There was always something else to do, always a new challenge on the horizon. Jack was no longer just a bright-eyed new assistant at Stewart and Associates. He was deep into the work now, immersed in the grind. Yet, despite his determination to succeed, something was beginning to gnaw at him. The pressure was taking its toll. He was working harder than ever, staying late into the night, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't quite meeting everyone's expectations. Rebecca Matthews, his supervisor, was a tough taskmaster. She seemed to have a sixth sense for when Jack was struggling, even if he tried to hide it. She had been pushing him relentlessly lately, assigning him more and more tasks with increasingly tight deadlines. Jack had always prided himself on being able to keep up with the pace, but he was starting to feel the cracks in his confidence. One afternoon, Jack was buried under a pile of case files when Rebecca approached his desk. She had that look again, one of quiet but firm resolve. "Jack, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge. Jack looked up, his heart racing. He wasn't sure if he was about to get another compliment for his hard work or if this was it, the moment she would tell him that he wasn't cut out for this world. He had been working late almost every night, trying to keep up with the ever-increasing workload, but deep down, he feared that it wouldn't be enough. "Sure, Rebecca. What's up?" Jack asked, trying to sound confident even though his stomach twisted in knots. Rebecca gestured for him to come with her. "Come to my office. I want to go over a few things." Jack followed Rebecca to her office, his mind spinning. He had no idea what to expect. As they entered her office, Rebecca closed the door behind them, and Jack took a seat across from her desk. The room was neatly organized, as always, but Jack could sense the tension in the air. "Jack," Rebecca began, leaning forward slightly, "I've been watching your progress here at the firm. And I have to say, I'm impressed with how quickly you've adapted. You've taken on a lot of responsibility, and you've handled it with a level of maturity I didn't expect from someone so new." Jack felt a brief surge of pride at her words, but before he could say anything, Rebecca continued. "But," she said, her voice becoming more serious, "I've noticed something. You're starting to wear thin. The late hours, the constant pressure, it's all catching up with you." Jack blinked, his mind racing. I'm doing my best, Rebecca. I'm putting in the hours. I know this is tough, but I can handle it." Rebecca shook her head slightly. "I'm not doubting your work ethic, Jack. But I want you to understand something, this job is relentless. There are times when the pressure will feel overwhelming, and that's when you have to decide if this is the life you really want. It's not just about being able to handle the work. It's about whether you can sustain it, day in and day out. You're capable, Jack. But if you're not careful, you'll burn out." Jack's heart dropped. Burn out? Was that really what was happening to him? "I don't want to see you run yourself into the ground," Rebecca added, her expression softening. "You've got potential, but you need to learn when to take a step back. Take care of yourself, Jack. This job requires more than just brains. It requires stamina." Jack sat in stunned silence. He had been so focused on proving himself that he hadn't even considered the toll it was taking on him. He had been so caught up in trying to impress everyone that he forgot to listen to his own body and mind. The stress, the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, it was all building up, and he hadn't seen it until now. Rebecca broke the silence. "I'm giving you a piece of advice, Jack. It's one of the hardest lessons you'll learn here, but it's essential. You're going to be a great lawyer, but only if you learn to manage the weight of this work. Otherwise, it's going to crush you. Remember that. Jack left Rebecca's office feeling disoriented. Her words kept echoing in his mind: burnout, sustainability. He had always prided himself on his ability to push through challenges, to ignore fatigue and keep going. But now, for the first time, he was questioning whether that was the right approach. As he sat back down at his desk, he tried to shake off the conversation. But the truth was, Rebecca was right. He had been so focused on impressing everyone, on proving that he could handle the weight of the legal world, that he had neglected his own well-being. The exhaustion was starting to show in his work. His concentration wasn't as sharp as it had been, and his mind wandered more often than he would like to admit. A small part of him was afraid that if he admitted he was struggling, he would fail. But another part of him realized that Rebecca had been right: he needed to find a balance. He couldn't be all work, all the time. He had to learn to take care of himself if he wanted to keep going. Later that evening, as Jack walked to his car, he spotted Daniel's name flashing on his phone. Jack hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey, man. How's it going?" Daniel's voice was as upbeat as always, but Jack could hear the faint concern in his tone. "I don't know, man," Jack replied, leaning against his car. "I've been pushing myself too hard. I think I might be burning out." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Burnout? That's not good, Jack. What's going on?" "I've been staying late every night, trying to keep up with everything. The pressure is getting to me, and I'm starting to feel it. I can't keep this pace up." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "You're not invincible, Jack. You need to take care of yourself. Look, I know you want to prove yourself, but if you break down, it won't matter how hard you work. You've got to pace yourself." Jack let out a heavy sigh. I know. I don't want to let anyone down. Hey, no one's expecting you to do it all at once. You've got to learn when to take a break. Trust me, if you burn out now, all that hard work will go to waste. You've got to find a way to make it sustainable." Jack felt a small sense of relief from Daniel's words. It was good to know that someone understood. "I'll try, man," Jack said quietly, the weight of the conversation settling over him. "I just don't want to fail." "You won't fail," Daniel reassured him. "But you've got to take care of yourself first." As Jack sat in his car, staring out at the dimly lit streets, he realized that he had been living in a constant state of fear of failure, fear of letting people down, fear of not being enough. But maybe, just maybe, the real key to success wasn't about pushing himself until he broke. It was about finding a way to balance his ambition with his health, his drive with his peace of mind. Jack knew he had a long way to go, but tonight, for the first time in a while, he felt like he might just have a chance to find that balance. Jack stood in front of his bathroom mirror the next morning, staring at his reflection. The dark circles under his eyes seemed to have deepened overnight, a visible sign of the exhausting pace he had been keeping. He had spent the better part of the evening contemplating Rebecca's words, and Daniel's advice. Both had cut through the fog of his exhaustion like a sharp blade, leaving him with the stark reality of what he had been doing to himself. But what was the alternative? Jack had come this far by pushing himself harder than anyone else. What if he let up now? What if he stopped giving it his all and became complacent? That thought was enough to send a surge of panic through him. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to risk failing now. He couldn't afford to let up. But could he keep up this pace without burning out? With a deep breath, Jack forced himself to get dressed and head out the door. Today was another busy day at Stewart & Associates, and there was no time to dwell on doubts. There were cases to work on, clients to meet, and expectations to meet. The office buzzed with its usual frenetic energy as Jack walked in. The staff seemed to be operating at full throttle, with the air thick with the weight of impending deadlines. Jack sat at his desk, trying to push the doubts out of his head. He had work to do. The first task on his agenda was a high-stakes case involving a class action lawsuit. The case was complex, with multiple parties involved, and the opposing counsel had already proven to be aggressive and unforgiving. Jack was determined to help the firm come out on top, but as he reviewed the case files, he felt the familiar pressure creeping back into his chest. The need to be perfect, the need to get every detail right, weighed heavily on him. He couldn't afford any mistakes, not on this case. Rebecca Matthews walked by his desk and paused when she saw him. "How's it going?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Busy," Jack replied, trying to sound casual. He didn't want her to know how much the pressure was starting to get to him. "Good. Don't let the pressure get to you, Jack," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "You've got the skills. Just focus, and you'll get through this." Her words were a reminder of what he had been telling himself all along: he was capable. Jack gave her a small nod, feeling a twinge of gratitude for her subtle encouragement. Maybe, just maybe, he could do this. But he couldn't do it alone. He had to learn how to manage his stress better, to balance the demands of his career with his need for rest and rejuvenation. The day passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and endless paperwork. Jack was moving from task to task, his mind racing, but something was different today. He wasn't letting the stress completely consume him. He was taking breaks, stepping away from his desk when he needed to clear his head. He even made time to go for a walk outside at lunch, something he hadn't done in weeks. By the time the afternoon rolled around, Jack felt strangely refreshed. For the first time in a while, he wasn't overwhelmed. He was tired, yes, but not drained. He had learned to take control of his stress rather than letting it control him. Jack's phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. It was a text from Daniel. "How's the balance thing going? Taking care of yourself?" Jack smiled at the message. He hadn't had time to text Daniel back since their conversation the night before, but he was grateful for the reminder. He quickly typed back. "Trying. Took a walk during lunch, and I feel better than I have in days. It's a start. Good to hear, man. Keep it up. You'll be more effective if you're not running on fumes." Jack nodded to himself, knowing Daniel was right. This was just the beginning, but it was a start. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he was learning. Slowly, he was figuring out that his mental health and physical well-being were just as important as his work ethic. The next few weeks passed in much the same way. Jack continued to work long hours, but now, he was careful to manage his stress. He made sure to take breaks when he needed them, to eat lunch away from his desk, and to take weekends off when possible. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of doubt, but he could feel himself growing stronger, more resilient. Rebecca took notice of his newfound approach. During a meeting one afternoon, she caught Jack's eye and gave him a brief, approving nod. It wasn't much, but it meant everything to him. For the first time since starting at Stewart & Associates, Jack felt like he was finding his rhythm. One afternoon, as Jack was wrapping up a late-night work session, he received an unexpected call. It was from his mom. "Hey, Jack," his mom's voice came through the phone, warm and comforting, as always. "How's everything going?" Jack sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the question. "It's going, well, I guess. It's tough, Mom. But I'm learning. I think I'm starting to figure things out." "That's good to hear, sweetheart," she replied, her voice filled with pride. "But don't forget to take care of yourself. You're not invincible." Jack chuckled softly. "I know, Mom. I'm trying. I promise." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and then his mom added, "You've always had a strong work ethic, Jack. But remember, you don't have to carry the world on your shoulders. It's okay to lean on others when you need to. Her words hit Jack harder than he expected. He had always prided himself on being independent, on taking care of things himself. But now, he was realizing that it was okay to ask for help, to lean on the people around him. He didn't have to do everything alone. "I will, Mom." "Thanks. I needed to hear that," Jack said quietly. That weekend, Jack took his mom's advice to heart. He made an effort to take a real break. He went out with Daniel for a hike in the mountains, spent some time reading for fun, and even indulged in a few episodes of his favorite TV show. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he had found some semblance of balance in his life. But even as he took time to rest, he knew that the real test would come soon enough. There were still high-stakes cases to manage, expectations to meet, and challenges to face. But this time, Jack felt ready. He wasn't just working hard. He was working smart. And most importantly, he was learning that success wasn't just about being the best. It was about sustaining the work, about finding a way to keep moving forward without sacrificing himself in the process. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act. Jack was finally starting to implement the lessons he had learned, taking care of himself, managing his stress, and carving out time to recharge. But just when he thought he had found his rhythm, a storm was brewing on the horizon, one that would test every ounce of his resolve. It started with a phone call from Rebecca, and Jack knew immediately that something was off. "Jack, I need you to come into my office," Rebecca said, her voice sounding unusually serious. "It's about the class action lawsuit. We've hit a major roadblock." Jack's stomach dropped at the mention of the lawsuit. This was the case that had been consuming most of his time and energy over the past several weeks, and if it went sideways, it could set the firm back by months. He'd been working diligently, researching case law, drafting motions, and organizing everything to ensure that the firm was prepared for whatever the opposition threw their way. But now, something had changed. And whatever it wasn't good. Jack quickly gathered his things and made his way to Rebecca's office, his mind racing. What had happened? Had something gone wrong with the settlement talks? Were there new developments in the case that they hadn't anticipated? When he walked into her office, he immediately noticed the tension in the air. Rebecca was sitting at her desk, her brow furrowed in concentration as she reviewed a series of documents. She looked up as Jack entered, offering a tight smile. "Take a seat, Jack," she said, motioning toward the chair across from her. Jack sat down, trying to steady his breathing. He was ready for whatever news Rebecca had to deliver, but the anxiety that coursed through his veins told him that it wasn't going to be easy. "We've hit a snag," Rebecca began, her voice calm but firm. "The opposing counsel has filed a motion for summary judgment. They're asking the judge to dismiss the entire case based on procedural grounds." Jack's mind spun for a moment. A motion for summary judgment was a serious matter. If granted, it could end the case before they had a chance to present their evidence in court. This wasn't just a minor setback, it was a full-blown crisis. "How did this happen?" Jack asked, his voice strained. "We weren't expecting this motion," Rebecca explained. "We've been so focused on the substance of the case that we overlooked some of the procedural issues. And now, they've found a way to exploit that." Jack's heart sank as he realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a mistake on the part of the opposing counsel, it was a reminder of how easily things could unravel when every detail wasn't carefully monitored. And with the stakes so high, a mistake could be disastrous. "Do we have a chance of winning this?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the rising tide of worry within him. Rebecca paused for a moment, considering her words carefully. "It's going to be difficult. The judge is going to look at this very closely. But we can't afford to let this go unchecked. We need to fight back. I'm going to need you to dive into the case law and find any precedents that could help us argue against this motion." Jack nodded, trying to suppress the knot in his stomach. "I'll get on it right away." Rebecca looked at him closely, her eyes thoughtful. "I know this is a lot to handle, but I believe in you, Jack. You've proven yourself time and again. I know you'll rise to the occasion." Jack felt a surge of determination. The pressure was immense, but he was ready to face it head-on. He had come too far to let this case slip through his fingers now. He had spent countless hours working toward this moment, and he couldn't back down, not when everything was on the line. For the next few days, Jack threw himself into the case with everything he had. He spent long hours at his desk, reading through legal journals, combing through precedents, and crafting arguments that could convince the judge to deny the opposing counsel's motion. He hardly ate or slept, driven by a sense of urgency that kept him up long into the night. But despite his best efforts, doubts began to creep into his mind. Was he overlooking something? Was there a detail he had missed that could cost them the case? The pressure was unbearable, and with every passing hour, the weight of the responsibility began to feel suffocating. Jack could feel the exhaustion setting in again. He had been working at a breakneck pace, and even with his newfound efforts to take care of himself, it was becoming clear that he was running on empty. But there was no time to stop. He had to keep going. The clock was ticking, and they couldn't afford to waste a second. It was late one night when Jack received another call from Rebecca. This time, her tone was different, more urgent. "Jack, I need you to meet me at the courthouse tomorrow. The hearing for the motion is at 10 a.m. I want you there with me to present our argument." Jack felt a surge of anxiety. He had known that this day was coming, but hearing it from Rebecca made it all the more real. Tomorrow was D-Day. "I'll be there," Jack replied, his voice steady despite the nervousness that was beginning to build. The next morning, Jack arrived at the courthouse early, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. He walked into the courtroom, scanning the room for Rebecca. She was already sitting at a table, reviewing her notes. Jack made his way over to her, his steps echoing in the empty space. "Ready?" Rebecca asked without looking up, as if she had already sensed his presence. Jack nodded, taking a seat beside her. "Ready as I'll ever be." For the next hour, the courtroom was filled with tension. The opposing counsel presented their case, arguing that the procedural issues were too significant to ignore and that the case should be dismissed. Jack listened intently, his mind working to formulate counterarguments that would be persuasive enough to sway the judge. Then, it was their turn. Rebecca stood and addressed the judge, her voice calm and authoritative as she laid out their argument. Jack watched in awe, admiring her confidence and poise. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up with a deep breath and walked to the front of the courtroom. His palms were sweaty, and his heart was pounding in his chest, but he kept his focus. He had prepared for this moment. He had practiced his lines, had reviewed the arguments, and now it was time to deliver. Jack spoke with confidence, presenting the precedents he had found and making a compelling case for why the judge should deny the motion. He could feel the weight of the moment, but he pushed it aside. This was what he had worked for. This was what he had prepared for. When the hearing concluded, the judge thanked both parties and promised to issue a ruling soon. Jack and Rebecca left the courtroom, their minds heavy with the uncertainty of the outcome. As they walked back to the office, Jack felt a strange sense of peace. The storm had passed, for now. He had given it his all. He had faced his fears and risen to the occasion, despite the doubts and exhaustion. Whatever happened next, he could hold his head high. "Good work, Jack," Rebecca said with a rare smile. "I couldn't have asked for a better argument." Jack smiled back, though he felt too tired to fully appreciate the compliment. "Thanks, Rebecca. It feels good to have gotten through it." Rebecca paused for a moment, her smile softening. "You've grown a lot since you first started here. You're not the same person who walked in that day looking for a job. You've become someone who can handle anything." Jack's chest swelled with pride. He still had a long way to go, but hearing those words from Rebecca meant more than he could express. For the first time in a while, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The days after the hearing were filled with uncertainty. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he had left something out, something critical. He had done everything he could, but the outcome was out of his hands. The weight of the unknown hung over him, making it impossible to focus on anything else. Every time his phone buzzed or he heard footsteps approaching his desk, he was ready for the worst news. But as the hours dragged on, nothing came. No updates, no phone calls. It was as if the world had come to a standstill, leaving Jack to wait for the judge's decision in the same kind of agonizing silence. It was late afternoon when his phone finally rang. Jack glanced at the screen, his heart skipping a beat when he saw it was Rebecca. "Jack, we've got the ruling," she said, her voice calm, but Jack could hear the tension in it. The judge denied the motion for summary judgment. The case moves forward. For a moment, Jack just stood there, unable to process the words. Then, slowly, the relief washed over him in waves. He exhaled deeply, his whole body sagging in exhaustion. That's great news," Jack said, his voice hoarse. Rebecca chuckled, though there was a note of relief in her laughter. "It's more than just great. It's huge. You did good work, Jack. You should be proud." Jack smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He was proud, he had every right to be, but that nagging feeling from earlier still lingered. Had he truly done everything he could? Had they narrowly escaped disaster? "I don't feel like I've done enough yet," Jack said, his voice quieter than he intended. "There's still so much left to do. I don't know. A little shaken, I guess." Rebecca's voice softened. "That's normal. You pushed yourself hard, and when you're in the heat of it, you don't always get the time to step back and reflect. But that's why I'm telling you, you did everything right. You gave it everything you had. That's all you can do." Jack nodded, though a part of him still couldn't let go of the uncertainty that clung to him like a shadow. But for the moment, he chose to believe Rebecca. She had been through this before. She had seen it all. "Thanks, Rebecca," Jack said, finally feeling like he could relax just a little. "I appreciate you. I'll be here tomorrow, ready to dive back in." "Good. We've still got a lot of work ahead of us, but this is a big win." "Let's keep the momentum going," Rebecca replied, sounding upbeat. As Jack hung up the phone, he allowed himself a brief moment to sit back in his chair and breathe. For the first time in days, he felt a tiny spark of hope flicker inside him. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The next few days at the office felt different. The air seemed lighter. The team was in high spirits, and the mood around the office was decidedly less tense. Jack noticed a change in himself as well. He was more relaxed, more focused. The weight that had been bearing down on him for weeks had been lifted, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could breathe again. But with the relief came a new sense of responsibility. The case wasn't over. Far from it. There was still a long road ahead. They had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. Jack knew he couldn't afford to get complacent now. He had to stay sharp, keep pushing, keep moving forward. As the team continued to work on the class action lawsuit, Jack threw himself back into the case with renewed energy. The win in court had given him the boost he needed, but now he was determined to finish what they had started. He was determined to see this case through to its conclusion, and to make sure that when the time came, they could claim a victory that truly mattered. In the weeks that followed, Jack and Rebecca continued to strategize, meeting with clients and drafting new motions. The case was still far from settled, but they had a clear path forward now. And every day, Jack grew more confident in his abilities. The earlier doubts, the nagging feeling that he wasn't enough, slowly faded into the background as he proved to himself that he was capable of handling whatever came his way. He had learned to balance his work with moments of rest, and the improvement in his mental and physical well-being was becoming apparent. He didn't feel overwhelmed anymore. He felt in control. It was during a particularly long meeting that the phone call Jack had been waiting for came. His phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced down at it, his heart skipping a beat when he saw that it was from Daniel. "Got any time to talk later?" the text read. Jack quickly typed a reply. "Absolutely. I'm free in an hour. Call then." After a few moments, the phone rang. "Hey, Jack." Daniel greeted him. "How's everything going?" "It's been crazy, but good. We got past the motion for summary judgment. The case is moving forward." "That's awesome," Daniel said, his excitement clear even through the phone. "You've been working so hard for this. You must be feeling like a weight's been lifted." "I am," Jack admitted. "But it's not over yet. There's still a lot to do. I'm just taking it one step at a time." Daniel was quiet for a moment, as if considering his words. "I get it. But just don't forget to take care of yourself along the way. You've made so much progress, Jack. You're not the same guy who walked into Stewart and Associates a few months ago. You've grown, and it's impressive." Jack felt a rush of gratitude for his friend's words. "Thanks, Daniel. I really appreciate that. It's been a wild ride, but I think I'm starting to figure it out." "Don't be too hard on yourself," Daniel added. "You're doing great. You just have to keep believing in yourself, okay?" Jack smiled, the tension that had been building inside him slowly dissipating. "Thanks, man. I needed to hear that." Later that week, Jack found himself reflecting on how far he had come. He had faced one of the toughest challenges of his career, and while it was far from over, he had already come a long way. It was hard to believe that not so long ago, he had been questioning whether he was cut out for this life. Now, he was learning to embrace the journey, no matter how difficult it might get. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Jack knew one thing for sure: he was no longer the same person who had walked into Stewart and Associates all those months ago. He was stronger, more capable, and more determined than ever to succeed. And this was just the beginning. It had been nearly a month since the judge's ruling, and Jack was beginning to feel the strain of the ongoing case. The victory in court had given them momentum, but now that momentum was starting to feel like a pressure cooker. Every day brought new challenges. Every new email, every call, every meeting felt like it could be the one that pushed them over the edge. But Jack had learned how to handle the stress, or at least, he thought he had. It was becoming harder to maintain the balance he had worked so hard to establish. Rebecca had been equally consumed by the case, throwing herself into every aspect of it with an intensity that matched Jack's own. But something in her demeanor had shifted. Where she had once exuded confidence and calm, there was now a hint of weariness in her eyes. Jack noticed it, though she never said a word about it. "Rebecca, are you okay?" Jack asked one afternoon as they worked late in her office. It was nearly 9 p.m., and the office was practically deserted except for the two of them. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed above them as they reviewed the latest deposition. She glanced up from the papers, offering a tired smile. "I'm fine. Just a little, worn out, I guess." Jack's gaze lingered on her. She had always been a workhorse, but now it seemed like she was pushing herself too hard. He couldn't help but feel that if anyone was nearing a breaking point, it might be her. "You know, you don't have to do it all yourself," Jack said gently, pushing back from his desk. "I can handle more of this. You've got a lot on your plate already." Rebecca shook her head, the smile faltering for a moment. "It's not about that. I'm not sure I've got it in me to push through this next phase. We're in too deep, and it feels like every decision is make or break. I don't know if we'll be able to pull it off." The vulnerability in her voice surprised Jack. This was the woman who had taken him under her wing when he first started at Stewart and Associates, who had taught him what it meant to be a lawyer. To hear her voice doubt was unsettling. "Rebecca, look at how far we've come. We're almost there. You taught me how to handle this pressure, and I'm not giving up on this case. We've got the strength, both of us." Rebecca met his gaze, a long silence stretching between them. Finally, she exhaled, shaking her head with a rueful smile. "I guess you're right. Maybe I've been holding on too tight. But I don't know if I can let go. Not when so much is riding on this." Jack could see that she was fighting to keep control. It was the same way he had felt just weeks ago, overwhelmed by the weight of the case and the fear of failing. But now, he realized, it wasn't just about the legal strategies or the evidence. It was about trust in each other and in their ability to make it through, no matter how hard it got. "Let's tackle this together," Jack said firmly. "We're a team. And we've got this." Rebecca studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before her lips curled into a faint smile. "You've come a long way, Jack. All right. Let's finish this." The next few days were a blur of activity as Jack and Rebecca prepared for the next big hurdle, the deposition of the key witness in the case. This witness's testimony would have the potential to swing the case in their favor, or destroy it completely. There was no middle ground. Jack couldn't shake the nervous energy that buzzed inside him as the day of the deposition approached. He had been through plenty of legal proceedings already, but this felt different. The stakes were higher than ever. If they lost the deposition, it could undo everything they had worked so hard to build. The night before the deposition, Jack sat in his apartment, unable to focus on anything else. He tried to read, to relax, but his mind kept racing back to the case. He couldn't help but replay every detail in his mind, second-guessing every argument and every piece of evidence. What if they missed something crucial? What if he made a mistake on the stand? Finally, he stood up and paced the room, trying to shake off the anxiety. He was on the brink of a mental breakdown, his nerves fraying at the edges, but then he remembered something Rebecca had told him: "You're never as ready as you think you are, Jack. But the moment you stop doubting yourself is the moment you realize you have everything you need." Jack stopped pacing, taking a deep breath. He had everything he needed. He had done the work. He had the knowledge. And most importantly, he had the trust of the team behind him. The morning of the deposition was tense. Jack met Rebecca at the office early, and the two of them drove to the courthouse together. The silence in the car was thick, both of them lost in their thoughts, mentally preparing for the battle ahead. When they arrived at the courthouse, Jack felt the familiar anxiety tighten in his chest. He tried to steady himself, to remind himself that he was prepared, that they were prepared. But the gravity of the situation hung over him like a dark cloud. They entered the courtroom, and the witness was already seated at the opposing counsel's table. Jack glanced over at Rebecca, who gave him a small nod. This was it. The moment they had been working toward for months. As the deposition began, Jack felt his confidence grow. He listened carefully to the witness's testimony, knowing that this was where the case could either break wide open or fall apart. He asked his questions with precision, guiding the witness through a series of statements designed to expose the flaws in their story. Rebecca was by his side, offering quiet support as they worked in sync. Minutes turned into hours, but Jack didn't lose focus. He pushed through, gathering the information they needed. And when it was finally over, they had what they came for, a critical piece of testimony that would likely turn the case in their favor. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Rebecca clapped Jack on the back. "You did great," she said, a genuine smile breaking through the tension. Jack could hardly believe it. They had done it. They had navigated one of the most difficult parts of the case and come out on top. But as they left the courthouse, Jack couldn't help but feel that the true test was still ahead. The case wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of hope. Maybe they really could pull this off. Back at the office, Jack sat at his desk, reflecting on the day's events. He thought about how far he had come since he first walked into the firm, unsure of himself and overwhelmed by the enormity of the work. He thought about the late nights, the doubts, the exhaustion. And he thought about the people who had helped him along the way, Rebecca, Daniel, and everyone else who had supported him through this journey. The road ahead was still long, but Jack knew now that he wasn't facing it alone. He had grown stronger, more capable, and more confident in his abilities. And no matter what came next, he was ready. The days following the deposition felt like a blur. Despite their success in securing the key testimony, the reality of the case began to sink in. Jack and Rebecca knew that this was just one step in a much larger journey, and the closer they got to trial, the more the pressure seemed to mount. Jack's exhaustion was palpable. His body ached from the sleepless nights, the constant meetings, and the mounting pile of legal briefs that seemed to grow with every passing day. But it wasn't just the physical toll, it was the mental exhaustion that had begun to chip away at his resolve. He found himself losing focus during meetings, unable to concentrate for long periods, and second-guessing every decision he made. Rebecca, too, was showing signs of wear. Though she tried to mask it behind her usual professional demeanor, Jack could see the strain in her eyes, the same strain that had begun to settle in his own. They had both been pushing too hard for too long, and neither of them was sure how much more they could take. It was a Friday afternoon when Jack finally reached his breaking point. He had just finished a grueling meeting with opposing counsel, and the weight of their argument felt like a heavy burden he couldn't shake off. He was sitting at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen, when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. "How are you holding up, man?" Jack stared at the message for a moment, debating whether to respond. He didn't want to admit how close to the edge he felt. But as he thought about it, he realized that maybe he did need to talk. Maybe he needed to admit that he was struggling. He typed a quick reply. "Honestly, not great. I'm starting to feel the weight of this case, and I'm not sure how much longer I can keep going like this." The phone rang almost immediately. "Jack," Daniel's voice came through, full of concern. "You've got to pace yourself. I know you're working hard, but you've got to take breaks. This case is important, but you're just one person. You can't carry the whole load on your own." Jack leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. I know. But every time I try to take a step back, it feels like I'm letting everyone down. I'm the one who's supposed to keep this case together, and if I mess up, it could all fall apart." Daniel was quiet for a moment before speaking again, his voice softer. "Jack, you're not in this alone. You've got Rebecca, and you've got me. You've been doing this for months now, and you've gotten this far because you've earned it. But you can't keep going like this. You're burning out." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. It was hard to hear, but Daniel was right. He had been so focused on the case that he had neglected to take care of himself. He had been so afraid of failure, of letting everyone down, that he had forgotten that he was only human. "I'm just scared, Daniel. Scared that if I don't do this perfectly, everything will fall apart. That all of the work we've put in will be for nothing." Daniel's voice was steady. "That's a heavy burden to carry. But you don't have to do it all yourself. You've got people who are in this with you. Lean on them." Jack was silent for a moment, the weight of Daniel's words sinking in. He had been so focused on the end goal that he had forgotten the importance of the people around him. Rebecca, Daniel, the whole team, they were all part of this journey, and they all had his back. "I'll try," Jack finally said, his voice small. "I'll try to let go a little." "Good," Daniel replied, his voice filled with encouragement. "You're not alone, Jack. You're never alone." The following Monday, Jack made a conscious decision to change his approach. He had already come so far, but he knew that he couldn't keep pushing at this pace. He couldn't keep running on empty. He sat down with Rebecca that morning to go over their strategy for the next phase of the case. For the first time in weeks, he was honest with her about how he had been feeling. "I've been burning the candle at both ends," he admitted. "And I'm not sure I can keep going like this. I need to find a way to manage the pressure." Rebecca studied him for a moment, her gaze softening. "Jack, you've been pushing yourself so hard. It's okay to take a step back. We've got a great team here. You don't have to do everything yourself." Jack felt a sense of relief wash over him. "Thanks, Rebecca. I think I've been too focused on trying to prove myself. I've been afraid of failing, of letting everyone down." Rebecca nodded, her expression understanding. "I get it. But you're not alone in this. We're a team, and we've been through a lot together. You don't have to carry it all." Jack took a deep breath, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little bit lighter. He had been so focused on the end goal that he had forgotten the most important part of the journey, the people around him, the ones who supported him, the ones who believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. That afternoon, Jack decided to take some time off. It wasn't much, just an hour or two, but it was enough to clear his head. He took a walk outside, the fresh air hitting his face as he strolled through the park near the office. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to just be present in the moment. He thought about how far he had come. How much he had grown. He thought about the long road ahead, but for the first time in a while, he wasn't consumed by fear. He wasn't consumed by the weight of the case. He was simply grateful. Grateful for the support of his friends, his colleagues, and for the chance to fight for something that mattered. Grateful for the lessons he had learned along the way. Grateful for the person he was becoming. When Jack returned to the office that afternoon, he felt more centered, more focused. He had been running on empty, but now he was ready to give it his all once again. That evening, as he sat at his desk, reviewing the next set of legal documents, Jack felt a new sense of clarity. He wasn't doing this alone. He never had been. And as the case continued to unfold, Jack knew that no matter what came next, he was ready. He was ready to face the challenges, to confront the obstacles, and to keep moving forward with the strength of his team behind him. The days following Jack's breakthrough were calmer, but a new tension loomed. With each passing week, the clock was ticking toward the trial. Jack knew that the final battle would require all his skill, all his knowledge, and all the support he had gathered. But just as they began to settle into a rhythm, a curveball came out of nowhere. It was late on a Wednesday when Rebecca burst into Jack's office, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. Jack had just been reviewing some pre-trial motions when he looked up, startled by her urgent presence. "Rebecca? What's going on?" Jack asked, quickly standing up, sensing the gravity of her appearance. Rebecca closed the door behind her, and Jack immediately noticed the unease radiating from her. She didn't speak right away, which only deepened his concern. She took a deep breath and handed him a folder, her hands shaking slightly. He opened it quickly, scanning the first page. "Jack, we've got a problem," Rebecca said quietly, her voice tight with frustration. Jack's eyes moved rapidly across the page, reading the shocking news. It was an anonymous tip sent to the firm, claiming that key evidence in the case had been tampered with, specifically, evidence that could shift the entire case in favor of the opposing side. The tip suggested that someone on their team might have been involved in manipulating crucial documents, casting doubt on the integrity of their entire case. The thought of betrayal hit Jack like a punch to the gut. The enormity of what this could mean was almost too much to comprehend. "No way," Jack muttered under his breath, feeling his stomach churn. "This has to be a mistake. There's no way anyone here would." Rebecca cut him off, her expression grim. "I thought so too. But we have to take this seriously. We've been in this case too long to let something like this derail us. Someone's going to try to destroy everything we've worked for. Jack shook his head, trying to clear the fog that had suddenly descended upon him. This was the last thing they needed. The case was already under enough pressure with the trial looming, but if their own team was implicated in something this serious, it could all fall apart. "We need to investigate this," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. His mind raced, trying to think through the best course of action. "We need to know who sent this tip. If this is true, it could completely blow up the case." Rebecca nodded, but there was no comfort in her expression. "We'll need to move carefully. If anyone finds out we're investigating within the firm, it could cause a panic. We need to keep this under wraps, at least for now." Jack was already pulling out his phone, dialing Daniel's number. He needed his friend's expertise on this. As the phone rang, Jack glanced at Rebecca. "We can't let this get out of control," he said. "We need to handle it quietly. The last thing we want is for someone else to start looking into this." Daniel picked up on the second ring. "Jack. What's up?" "We have a serious problem," Jack replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "We've gotten an anonymous tip about potential evidence tampering. Someone on our team could be involved." Daniel's silence on the other end was deafening for a few moments. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and controlled. "I'll be there in an hour. Keep this between us for now. We don't want anyone panicking or making hasty decisions." After hanging up, Jack turned to Rebecca. "Daniel's on his way. We'll figure this out." But despite his words, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that gnawed at him. Who could have done this? Who among them would risk everything for personal gain? They had all worked so hard on this case. But now, all their hard work was threatened by something they hadn't even seen coming. By the time Daniel arrived at the office, the air had grown thick with anxiety. He was a tall, no-nonsense kind of guy, his sharp mind always able to cut through the noise. But even he seemed visibly shaken by the severity of the situation. "All right," Daniel said, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Jack. "What's the full story?" Rebecca explained the situation in detail, outlining the contents of the tip and the specific allegations against their team. As she spoke, Jack felt the weight of every word. This wasn't just a bump in the road, it was a potential disaster. "Do we have any reason to believe the tip is legitimate?" Daniel asked, his tone analytical, though there was a hard edge to it. "We don't know yet," Rebecca replied. "But we need to be cautious. If there's any truth to this, it could destroy our entire case. We could lose everything." Daniel paused, his mind clearly racing as he processed the information. "We need to gather as much information as possible. First, we look into the evidence mentioned in the tip and trace its origin. We'll need to be thorough, but we also need to be quick. I'll start running some background checks on the people involved and see if anything unusual shows up. You two, stay on the legal front. We don't want to tip anyone off until we have something concrete." Jack nodded. "Got it. We'll keep quiet for now and focus on tracking down whoever might be behind this." For the next few days, the investigation moved at a frenzied pace. Jack and Rebecca remained in the dark, working tirelessly while Daniel followed every lead he could. They both knew that if they were going to uncover the truth, they couldn't afford to make mistakes. Every decision, every action, was now under a microscope. The more they dug, the more troubling things became. They found discrepancies in the paper trail, inconsistencies in witness statements, and signs of tampered documents. With every new revelation, the suspicion that someone from within their team might be involved seemed more and more likely. But who? Jack felt like they were chasing shadows, every corner they turned only revealing more questions. Rebecca, too, was feeling the pressure. Her usual calm demeanor was beginning to crack under the strain. They had been working around the clock, and even though they were getting closer to uncovering the truth, Jack could see that her patience was wearing thin. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Jack," Rebecca admitted one evening as they sat in her office, poring over the evidence. "We're this close to falling apart. We've got the trial looming, and now this? I feel like we're losing control of everything." Jack looked at her, understanding the weight she was carrying. He had been feeling the same way. But he also knew that they couldn't afford to give up now. "We can't give up, Rebecca," Jack said, his voice firm. "We're so close. I know this is tough, but we've come this far. We can't let it all fall apart." Rebecca sighed, running a hand through her hair. "You're right. But sometimes, I just don't know if I can keep it together." Jack reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. "We'll get through this. Together. We're not in this alone." Rebecca looked at him, her eyes softening. "I know. Thanks, Jack." And for the first time in days, Jack allowed himself to relax, even just a little. They had their doubts, but they also had each other. And that, he realized, was what would get them through this, no matter what. The next few days felt like a race against time. As the pressure built, so did the urgency. The trial was fast approaching, and Jack and Rebecca had no choice but to press forward. The investigation into the tampered evidence was becoming a labyrinth of dead ends, each lead more perplexing than the last. The team had split into different groups to chase down every potential lead, but with each passing hour, the weight of the unknown grew heavier. Jack sat at his desk late one night, staring at the mountain of files in front of him. The office was quiet, save for the soft hum of the overhead lights. He'd been here for hours, going through the same documents over and over again, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain what had happened. But the answers eluded him. Rebecca walked in, her face tired but resolute. She had been working just as tirelessly, but her composure hadn't wavered, at least, not outwardly. Jack looked up at her, his mind racing. "I think we're running out of time," Jack said, rubbing his eyes. "We're digging, but we're not getting anywhere." Rebecca didn't respond immediately. She walked over to his desk, glancing down at the papers before meeting his gaze. Her eyes were hard, but there was a flicker of something more, something deeper. "Jack, I think I found something," she said quietly. His heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "I think I know who's behind it," Rebecca replied, her voice steady but laced with an emotion Jack couldn't quite place. Jack leaned forward, suddenly more alert. "Who?" Rebecca hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "I've been going through the staff's financial records, cross-checking with the files we've had stolen. And there's one name that keeps popping up, Evan Parker." Jack's mind immediately snapped to attention. Evan Parker had been a young associate at the firm, fresh out of law school. Quiet, diligent, and seemingly without a flaw. At least, that's what everyone had thought. But Rebecca's words made him rethink everything. "Evan? No way. Are you sure?" Jack's voice was sharp with disbelief. The very idea of Evan being involved in something so underhanded didn't make sense. He had always seemed so trustworthy. Rebecca nodded slowly. "I've checked everything. The discrepancies in the evidence. They all lead back to him. The tampered documents, the mysterious emails from an untraceable address, they all trace back to his computer." Jack's chest tightened. He had worked alongside Evan, seen him in the trenches during this case. The idea that someone so close to the team could be involved in something like this sent a chill down his spine. "We need to confront him," Jack said, his voice low. "This has to end now." Rebecca looked at him, a mix of worry and determination in her eyes. "If we confront him, we risk everything. He might run, or worse, he might turn on us. We need more evidence before we make any move." Jack stood up abruptly, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. "I know. But we can't afford to wait any longer. This is bigger than just the case. If we let this go, we'll lose everything, our credibility, our reputation, everything. Rebecca's expression softened. She understood. Jack wasn't just fighting for the case anymore. He was fighting for the integrity of everything they had worked so hard to build. And that meant taking risks, even if it was dangerous. Okay, Rebecca agreed, her voice steady. We'll move carefully. We'll set up a meeting with him. But we need to be ready for anything. The next morning, Jack and Rebecca met with Daniel and the rest of the team to devise a plan. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. If Evan was really behind the tampering, they had to make sure they caught him red-handed, without giving him any chance to slip away. They decided to bring Evan in under the guise of a routine meeting, something that wouldn't raise any suspicion. The plan was simple: Jack would confront him, Rebecca would watch for any signs of guilt, and Daniel would monitor the situation from a secure location. The tension in the office was palpable as they waited for Evan to arrive. Jack's mind raced with the possibilities. If Evan was really guilty, what did that mean for the rest of the team? Would anyone else be involved? How deep did this go? When Evan finally walked into the conference room, his demeanor was calm, almost too calm. He greeted Jack and Rebecca with his usual polite smile, unaware of the storm that was about to break. Good morning, Jack, Rebecca. What's this about? Evan asked, his voice light, though there was an edge of curiosity in it. Jack gestured for him to sit. We need to talk, he said, his voice firm. It's about the case. Evan's expression shifted ever so slightly, a flicker of unease that was quickly masked by a confident smile. Of course. What's the issue? We've found some discrepancies in the evidence, Jack continued, leaning forward. Discrepancies that seem to trace back to you. Evan's eyes widened slightly, but only for a moment. His gaze quickly shifted to Rebecca, then back to Jack. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice a little too smooth. I've been working on the case just like everyone else. I don't know anything about tampered evidence. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest. He could tell Evan was lying. The tension in the room thickened, and Jack could see the nervousness creeping into Evan's otherwise calm demeanor. We have proof, Rebecca said, her voice cutting through the tension. Emails, files. Everything leads back to you. Evan's eyes darted to the door, and for the briefest moment, Jack saw panic flash across his face. But he quickly composed himself, folding his arms across his chest. This is a mistake, Evan insisted, his voice tight. You've got it all wrong. But Jack wasn't buying it. He stood up and walked around the table, coming closer to Evan. I'm not wrong, Evan. We've seen the evidence. And now you're going to tell us the truth. For a moment, Evan didn't say anything. His eyes flicked toward the door again, and Jack could almost see the gears turning in his mind. He was calculating his next move, deciding whether to run or to face the consequences. I didn't want it to go this far, Evan finally said, his voice shaking slightly. I thought I could fix it. I thought if I just adjusted a few things, it would all be okay. But it all spiraled out of control. Jack's heart sank. This was the moment. Evan wasn't just a bystander in this, he was the mastermind. The person who had endangered everything. You're going to pay for this, Evan, Jack said, his voice cold, his resolve hardening. Evan hung his head, defeated. I never meant for it to get this bad. I didn't know what else to do. Rebecca stepped forward, her expression hard. You're done, Evan. We'll make sure the authorities know everything. The rest of the meeting went quickly. Jack and Rebecca made the necessary calls to authorities, and Evan was quietly escorted out of the office. As he left, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The truth had finally come to light. But there was no real victory in this. The damage had been done, and the case was far from over. Now, Jack and Rebecca had to figure out how to salvage what was left of their credibility, and prepare for the final showdown in court. The courtroom was abuzz with the usual pre-trial chatter. Jack stood at the defense table, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The weight of the last few weeks had been crushing, but he had made it. He had made it through the chaos of the investigation, the stress of confronting a betrayer within their own team, and the emotional toll of the entire ordeal. But now, the trial was about to begin, and Jack knew that this was the moment where everything would either come together or fall apart. Rebecca was seated beside him, her posture straight, her eyes scanning the room. Daniel had been working behind the scenes to ensure that the final preparations were in place, but now it was all up to them, the jury, the judge, and the testimony they would present. There was no turning back now. Jack looked over at the opposing side. They were sitting across the room, calm, collected, but he could see the flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. This wasn't just any case. This was the culmination of months of hard work and dedication, and Jack had every intention of seeing it through to the end. The door to the courtroom swung open, and the judge walked in. The room fell silent, all eyes on the bench. Judge Harris, a tall man with a reputation for being tough but fair, took his seat and gave a quick nod to the bailiff. "Court is now in session," Judge Harris said, his voice commanding the room's attention. "We're here today for the case of the State versus Anderson. Will the defense please present its opening statement?" Jack stood up, taking a deep breath as he faced the jury. His mind raced, but he knew he had to remain calm, collected. This was it. His moment to shine. He glanced at Rebecca, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. He knew she had his back. And for once, he felt ready. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Jack began, his voice steady but firm. "What we have here today is not just a case about tampered evidence or questionable decisions. This is a case about truth, about justice, and about what happens when the system that's supposed to protect us fails. This is a case about my client, Sarah Anderson, who was wrongfully accused of a crime she did not commit." He paused, letting his words sink in, making eye contact with the jurors. "We will show you that the evidence presented by the prosecution has been manipulated, doctored, and even fabricated. And we will prove that Sarah Anderson was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. We ask that you keep an open mind and remember the most important principle of our justice system: innocent until proven guilty." Jack could see some jurors nodding, their expressions thoughtful. He knew this was just the opening round, but it was important to make a strong first impression. The case was complex, but Jack had faith in his ability to dismantle the opposition piece by piece. When Jack finished his statement, Rebecca stood up beside him, her eyes focused as she addressed the jury. "I'll be brief," she said. "But I want you to think about one thing as we move forward: what is the cost of justice? What is the price we pay when someone is wrongfully accused? Sarah Anderson's life has been turned upside down, and today, we're asking for the opportunity to make things right. We're asking for the chance to restore her honor, her integrity, and her future. I'm confident that once you hear all the facts, you'll agree that she deserves to walk out of this courtroom with her innocence intact." Her words, as always, were calculated and powerful. Jack felt a rush of pride for her. She was more than just a colleague. Rebecca was his partner in every sense of the word, and together, they had overcome the impossible. The trial moved forward at a breakneck pace. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented, and arguments were made. But Jack could feel the tension growing. The prosecution was strong, but their case was based on questionable evidence that had been manipulated, evidence that now had a glaring hole in its integrity. Then, it was their turn. Jack had spent sleepless nights preparing the cross-examination of the prosecution's lead witness, a detective who had been instrumental in gathering the so-called evidence against Sarah. The detective had testified that everything had been handled above board, but Jack knew better. He had spent hours poring over every document, every file, every single piece of information, and he was ready to expose the cracks in their story. The courtroom was silent as Jack walked up to the witness stand. Detective Williams, a burly man in his mid-40s, gave Jack a sharp look as he took the stand. He was used to the pressure, but Jack knew that even the most experienced witnesses could falter when the right questions were asked. "Detective Williams," Jack began, his voice calm but precise, "you've testified that the evidence presented in this case was handled according to protocol. Is that correct?" "That's correct," the detective responded, his voice unwavering. Jack took a step forward, leaning in just slightly. "And you were the one who personally oversaw the collection and handling of the key evidence, correct?" "I was," the detective affirmed. Jack paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment. He could feel the weight of the room on him. This was the moment that could change everything. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, placing it on the table in front of him. "Detective Williams, I'd like you to take a look at these documents," Jack said, sliding the folder toward him. "These documents show that the evidence you claim was intact was actually altered, specifically, the witness statements, the timestamps on the evidence, and the chain of custody reports. These discrepancies suggest that the evidence was manipulated long before it made its way to this courtroom. Would you care to explain that?" The detective's face hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, his eyes darting around. Jack didn't flinch. He pushed the folder a little closer. "You don't have to look too hard to see the inconsistencies, detective. In fact, one of the timestamps on the evidence matches an email sent from your account, an email to someone who shouldn't have had access to the case files." The room went completely still. Every eye in the courtroom was on the detective, and Jack could see him sweating, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. He had been caught. "I didn't," the detective began, but Jack didn't let him finish. "Your own actions have exposed the flaws in this case," Jack said, his voice firm, but there was an undertone of compassion. "It's time for the truth to come out. You manipulated the evidence. You framed Sarah Anderson. And now, we're going to make sure the truth gets out, no matter what it costs." The detective's face twisted with guilt and fear. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It wasn't supposed to go this far." The prosecutor, realizing the gravity of the situation, stood up quickly. "Objection, Your Honor." Judge Harris slammed his gavel. "Sustained. Detective, you will answer the question." And then, the dam broke. The detective, realizing that his defense had crumbled, collapsed into himself, giving Jack and Rebecca everything they needed to prove Sarah's innocence. The case that had seemed so complicated just days before now felt like it was falling into place. By the end of the trial, the jury had been given all the evidence they needed to make their decision. Jack sat at the defense table, his heart pounding. He had done everything he could. He had exposed the truth. He had fought tooth and nail for Sarah. Now, it was up to them. The jury deliberated for hours, the silence of the room stretching on. Finally, the bailiff came in with the verdict. "Will the jury please rise?" the judge called. The room held its breath as the foreman stepped forward, the paper with the verdict in his hand. He cleared his throat and spoke clearly, his voice steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Sarah Anderson, not guilty of all charges." The words hit like a wave crashing against the shore. The room erupted in a mixture of relief and disbelief. Jack felt the weight lift from his shoulders, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe. Sarah, sitting next to Jack, looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life." Jack nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "No. You saved yourself. You just needed someone to believe in you." And as the courtroom emptied, Jack felt the weight of everything they had been through. They had fought through the impossible, and now they had won. It wasn't just a victory in the courtroom, it was a victory for truth, for justice, and for the belief that no matter how dark things seemed, there was always a way to make things right. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?